Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull whatever you have close, dim the light if you haven't already, and let the wasteland come to you. What follows is a slow, unhurried journey through the darkest corners of the Fallout universe. The hidden histories, the buried theories, the questions that linger long after the credits roll. No rush, nowhere to be. Just the quiet hum of a Pip-Boy and stories that have been waiting in the rubble for a very long time. War. War never changes. That phrase has been spoken at the beginning of almost every Fallout game. It lands differently each time you hear it. Sometimes it sounds like a warning, sometimes it sounds like an apology, and sometimes, when you've spent enough time reading the old terminal entries and listening to the audio logs and piecing together what actually happened before the bombs fell, it sounds like a confession. This is a world built on secrets layered over secrets. A world where the companies meant to save humanity engineered its destruction. Where the government that claimed to fight for freedom was running experiments on its own citizens. Where the monsters aren't always the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones in clean suits behind reinforced glass, watching through one-way mirrors and taking notes. So settle in. We're going to visit some of those places tonight. There is a moment at the beginning of the Amazon Prime series that stays with you. The sky above Los Angeles turns a particular shade of amber, and a man who used to be a cowboy movie star stands in a suburban backyard watching the horizon ignite. He's watching the end of everything. And the most terrifying part of that image isn't the fireballs spreading across the skyline. It's what we come to understand, slowly, through the layers of the story that someone chose this, that it didn't have to happen. October 23rd, 2077. That's the date branded into the consciousness of every person who has ever played a Fallout game. The Great War, lasting just 2 hours, beginning and ending on a Saturday morning that became the last morning the old world would ever see. In those 120 minutes, civilization as humanity had known it for thousands of years was reduced to ash and shadow and irradiated silence. The official account, if you can call anything in the Fallout universe official, goes something like this. By 3:37 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, a squadron of high-altitude bombers was detected off the Bering Strait, believed to be Chinese. Unknown submersible objects had already been spotted off the coast of California by the United States Pacific Fleet just after midnight. At least one Chinese stealth submarine, a vessel later known as the Yangtze, moved close to the American eastern seaboard and launched nearly its entire payload of warheads, all but one, which failed to deploy due to a malfunction. By 9:13 that same morning, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System confirmed the first 4 missile launches, and the United States went to DEFCON 2. 4 minutes after that, the confirmation became irreversible. The fate of the world was sealed before most people had finished their morning coffee. The assumption, the one that sat unchallenged for decades of in-game lore, was that China fired first. That the resource wars that had consumed the globe for the better part of 20 years, wars fought over the last scraps of petroleum and clean water, finally reached their inevitable conclusion. China invaded Alaska. America pushed back. Things escalated, as they always do. And then someone, somewhere, made the decision that ended everything. But here's where it gets complicated. For years, the question of who fired the very first nuclear weapon hung unanswered in the lore. Tim Kaine, the co-creator of the original Fallout game, stated in an interview in 2023 that in his conception of the story, China fired first. That the Great War was retaliation for American bioweapon experiments on Chinese soil. That made a certain kind of horrible sense. Escalation. Desperation. 2 exhausted, fractured superpowers with their fingers on buttons they'd been hovering over for years. But the Amazon Prime television series, which Todd Howard confirmed as canon to the franchise, tells a different story. A more disturbing one. Because it wasn't China that fired first. And it might not have been America either. It might have been a corporation. This is the Vault-Tec theory. And the series doesn't just hint at it, it essentially confirms it. Or at least confirms that Vault-Tec's leadership seriously considered pulling the trigger themselves. In the final episode of the first season, viewers watching through Cooper Howard's hidden surveillance witness something that reframes the entire mythology of the Fallout universe. Representatives from Vault-Tec, Robco Industries, West-Tec, and Big Mountain Technology are gathered in a room, and Barb Howard Cooper's wife, a high-ranking Vault-Tec executive, floats the suggestion that Vault-Tec should drop the first bombs themselves. The logic she presents is devastatingly simple. They've built the vaults. They've made the pitch to the public and the government. But nuclear war isn't guaranteed anymore. Scientists like Lee Moldaver have developed cold fusion technology, a potential infinite energy source that could relieve the international tensions that make war seem inevitable. If cold fusion becomes public, if the resource crisis is solved, then nobody needs Vault-Tec, nobody needs the shelters. All those vaults, all that investment, all that infrastructure, it becomes worthless overnight. So why not just make sure the war happens? The cattle ranchers, one character explains to Cooper, now have more power than the sheriff. When a trillion-dollar company owns half of everything, and the government is too weakened by a decade of conventional war to restrain them, the ranchers can burn the town down if it suits them. And burn it down they apparently did. What's extraordinary about this revelation is how perfectly it fits the larger narrative of Fallout. The games have always painted Vault-Tec as monstrous. The vaults are not shelters. They were never really shelters. They were laboratories, and the human beings inside them were the test subjects. We'll get into the specifics of those experiments in a later section, and believe me, they are significantly worse than most people realize. But the underlying question was always, why? Why go to the trouble of building these elaborate underground facilities and filling them with people you're just going to torture and manipulate and experiment on? What were they building toward? If Vault-Tec manufactured the war, the answer becomes clear. They weren't preparing for a disaster they couldn't control. They were preparing for a disaster they planned. The vaults were never about saving humanity. They were about controlling the version of humanity that emerged on the other side. About ensuring that when the world was rebuilt, it was rebuilt according to Vault-Tec's specifications, under Vault-Tec's authority, with Vault-Tec's people at the top of whatever new civilization rose from the rubble. And there's another layer to this that the games had been quietly suggesting for years before the show made it explicit. Think about the timing of everything. Vault-Tec didn't build these facilities in a few years. The Vault program was a massive, decades-long project requiring resources and planning and secrecy on an almost impossible scale. The experiments embedded within them weren't afterthoughts. They were designed, detailed. Each vault's cruel social experiment was mapped out in advance, with overseers recruited and briefed and psychologically profiled. You don't build that kind of infrastructure if you're not certain the bomb is going to drop. You only build it if you already know. Captain Zhao is a character in Fallout 4, a Chinese ghoul who has spent 200 years sitting in a broken submarine off the coast of Boston. He is the last surviving crew member of the Yangtze, the vessel that launched nuclear missiles at the American East Coast. When you speak with him, when you dig into his history, something remarkable emerges. Even he doesn't know whether China fired first. A man who was literally aboard one of the submarines that launched warheads at American cities, and he cannot tell you with certainty whether his nation struck first or was responding to something else. The ambiguity is intentional. It's deeply intentional. Because Fallout has never really been a story about who fired first. It's been a story about the kind of world that makes firing first feel inevitable. A world where corporations have more power than governments, where the pursuit of resources becomes indistinguishable from the pursuit of dominance, where the people in charge have slowly convinced themselves that they are the only ones who deserve to survive. The pre-war United States in the Fallout universe is not a subtle satirical target. It is a funhouse mirror version of mid-20th century American optimism pushed to its logical, extreme retro-futuristic aesthetics and smiling advertisements and gleaming technology layered over something deeply rotten. Resource wars consuming the Middle East, the annexation of Canada, internment camps for Chinese American citizens, a government running biological weapon experiments on its own soldiers without their knowledge or consent, and underneath all of it, a corporate ecosystem that had grown so large, so powerful, so intertwined with the machinery of the state, that the distinction between public interest and private profit had completely dissolved. The bombs fell, and the people who planned for them to fall were already underground, already watching, already running their experiments. Some theories have gone even further. There's a reading of the Vault-Tec conspiracy that suggests the company wasn't just a participant in the decision to go to nuclear war. They were the architects of an entire future civilization. The Vault experiments, analyzed together, form a kind of grand research program. What happens to human beings under extreme stress? Under radical social engineering? Under total isolation? Under manufactured scarcity? Under the influence of drugs or propaganda or religious ideology deliberately introduced into a closed population? What is the minimum viable social structure for producing obedient, useful human beings who can be deployed to build a new world on someone else's terms? Add the forced evolutionary virus research, which the television series explicitly links to Vault-Tec's operations through the Future Enterprise Ventures project and through Barb Howard herself. And the picture becomes even darker. Vault-Tec wasn't just studying normal human behavior. They were studying how to change what humans are, how to engineer a species better suited to the world they wanted to create. Whether that world ever got built is another question entirely. Vault-Tec's own leadership presumably went underground somewhere. The surviving leadership of major pre-war corporations scattered into the vaults and bunkers and secret facilities they'd prepared for themselves. And 200 years later, their descendants and their projects and their unfinished experiments are still out there in the wasteland, still shaping the world, still being discovered by wanderers who stumble across terminal entries and wonder at the horror that ordinary people in ordinary offices once sat down and planned. One of the strangest and most poignant details buried in this history is the Vault-Tec representative who shows up at your door at the beginning of Fallout 4. He's nervous. He's hurried. He gets your family signed up for Vault 111 in what seems like minutes, apologizing for the rush, explaining that quotas are filling up faster than expected. He doesn't get into the vault when the bombs fall. He ends up wandering the wasteland, ghoulified and utterly broken, a sad footnote in the story of a company that used him as a salesman and gave him nothing in return. Even the people who worked for Vault-Tec were disposable. The company didn't save its employees. It saved its data, its experiments, its executives, and its vision. The man who knocked on your door to sell you a future was left outside in the fire just like everyone else. That detail is very Fallout. That detail is the whole story, really. Let's slow down and really sit with the vaults for a while. 122 vaults. That's the number the lore has settled on. 122 underground facilities built across the United States under Project Safehouse, officially a government-contracted civilian protection initiative. Vault-Tec won the contract. Vault-Tec built the shelters. And Vault-Tec quietly, methodically, embedded a different purpose inside almost every single one of them. Of those 122 vaults, only 17 were what you might call genuine control vaults, facilities designed with the actual intention of keeping their inhabitants alive and eventually repopulating a viable society. Vault 8, which led to the founding of Vault City in Northern California. Vault 13, the starting point of the original Fallout game. Vault 76, activated as a kind of early return experiment for Fallout 76's Appalachian story. Vault 101, designed to remain sealed indefinitely as a permanent closed-system experiment. That leaves 105 vaults with other purposes. 105 facilities, where the people who trusted Vault-Tec enough to sign their names and step through those heavy circular doors became, whether they knew it or not, laboratory subjects. The variety of those experiments is extraordinary in the worst possible way. Some of them are blunt and brutal. Some are almost philosophically curious in their cruelty. The kind of thing you can imagine a certain type of cold academic proposing in a white paper without ever having to look the subjects in the eye. Vault 12 sits in Necropolis, California. The experiment there was deceptively simple. The vault door was designed not to seal properly. It was built to fail. The inhabitants were exposed to gradual, progressive radiation poisoning, and the experiment was studying the effects of that slow contamination on a contained human population. The people of Vault 12 became ghouls the wandering, irradiated near immortals who populate the Fallout wasteland in varying states of consciousness and cognitive function. They thought they were safe. They were the control group in a radiation study they never consented to join. Vault 22 contained research into pest control, using specialized plant fungi. The experiment went wrong as so many did, and the plants took over. The fungal spores became airborne. The vault's inhabitants were transformed, their minds consumed, their bodies eventually reduced to something between human and vegetation. By the time anyone reaches Vault 22 in Fallout New Vegas, the place is a suffocating, dangerous ruin of overgrowth and mutated horror. The notes and terminals tell a story of researchers who understood what was happening to them and couldn't stop it. Vault 29 was populated exclusively with children under the age of 15. All of the adults were redirected at the last moment, the entrance sealed before they could board. ZAX, a supercomputer programmed with an environmental ideology, raised those children in a vault that celebrated nature and condemned technology. The adults were told the vault was full. The children grew up in isolation, shaped entirely by an artificial intelligence's curated worldview, with no one to tell them anything different. Vault 34 is one of the more viscerally disturbing examples. The experiment there involved an oversupply of weapons, guns, ammunition, explosives, all of it deliberately introduced into a sealed environment with a population under extreme stress. The results were exactly what you'd expect if you spent more than 30 seconds thinking about it. The vault tore itself apart. By the time the game reaches it, the place is radioactive and overrun with feral ghouls, the remnants of people who irradiated themselves to death in a space that handed them every tool for violence and nothing for peace. Vault 42 was given no lights. The entire vault was kept in total darkness as a study of whether human beings could establish a functional society without the ability to see each other clearly, without visual cues for social hierarchy, without the subtle body language that underpins so much of human communication. The experiment assumed, perhaps cynically, that darkness would break people down faster. Whether it did is something left to the imagination. Vault 75, tucked beneath a mall in the Commonwealth, the irradiated remains of Massachusetts, spent its time subjecting children to brutal physical and psychological conditioning programs. The adults were eliminated. The children who survived the training were tested for aptitude and potential, and then either promoted or disposed of. The vault was functioning as a program to breed and select for a particular kind of enhanced human. Enhanced in the sense that they were physically superior and emotionally calibrated toward obedience and lethality. The Gunners, a mercenary faction in Fallout 4, are believed to be the descendants or products of Vault 75's program. Vault 87 received what was arguably the worst assignment of any vault in the eastern United States. The Evolutionary Experimentation Program, the Vault-Tec version of the forced evolutionary virus research we'll explore in detail shortly, pumped FEV directly into the atmosphere of the vault. The inhabitants were given no warning, no preparation, and no choice. They simply began to change. The super mutants of the capital wasteland, the green-skinned, brutish, shambling figures that haunt Fallout 3's landscape, are the products of Vault 87. Each of them was once a person who thought they were safe underground. Vault 108 is the one that tends to make people a little uneasy when they first encounter it, because the horror of it is so mundane and so escalating. The experiment involved a cloning chamber, and one particular subject named Gary. Gary was cloned, and cloned again, and the cloning process, as it iterated through successive copies, produced something increasingly unhinged. The vault eventually contained nothing but Gary clones, dozens and then hundreds of them, each one aggressive, territorial, and capable of only one word of communication: Gary. The original inhabitants are gone. The Garys remain, filling the tunnels of the vault, attacking anything that isn't Gary, a surreal nightmare of identical faces and identical fury. The sociological experiments are no less dark for being less immediately violent. Vault 117 was given only one overseer, with no guidance on succession. What happens to a contained society when the only authority figure dies with no plan for replacement? Vault 92 played loud white noise randomly to its inhabitants, a community of trained musicians who'd been recruited specifically for the experiment to study the effects of disrupted sleep and progressive noise trauma on creative people under stress. Vault 101 was specifically designed to never open. Its overseer was instructed to enforce the belief that the outside world was permanently uninhabitable and that the vault was the only sanctuary that would ever exist. Generations of people lived and died in Vault 101 believing the surface was a death sentence. It wasn't. But they were never supposed to know. What makes all of this especially haunting is the question of what Vault-Tec thought they were building toward, because it wasn't random. The experiments weren't the projects of individual rogue scientists. They were organized, funded, and coordinated at the corporate level. There was a purpose to the data being collected. The question of what that purpose was, what the grand unified theory of the Vault program amounted to, is one the games have only answered in fragments. The television series points towards something even more disturbing. Vault 31, 32, and 33, the vaults seen in the show, were operating as a breeding program. Vault 31 preserved the actual employees of Vault-Tec, held in cryogenic sleep, while the other two vaults served as their gene pool. The people of Vaults 32 and 33 were never told this. They were allowed to believe they were independent communities engaged in a mutual aid alliance. They were actually livestock in a program designed to produce genetically suitable offspring for Vault-Tec's leadership class to inherit the post-war world. Hank McLean, the overseer revealed to be a Vault-Tec executive who went underground with his family, had the access codes to wake the executives in Vault 31. The plan was always to let the wasteland burn itself out for a few generations, then emerge with a hand-picked, ideologically reliable population and rebuild civilization from the top down. A civilization where the people who planned the apocalypse would also be the ones who wrote the history books. Tim Kaine, the original creator of the franchise, has a theory about the Vault program that adds an interesting practical dimension to all of this. His view is that Vault-Tec severely underbid on the contract. They promised to build 1,000 vaults. They couldn't actually build anything close to that number. The experiments in this reading weren't purely ideological, they were also a cover. A way to make the vaults they did manage to build seem purposeful and scientific, rather than revealing that the company had taken a government contract they couldn't fulfill. The cruelty was, in part, a kind of desperate improvisation. Whether that's more or less disturbing than the alternative that every single experiment was coldly premeditated is hard to say. Both versions leave you sitting with the same image. Normal people in normal clothes, in bright pre-war offices with motivational posters on the walls, writing the specifications for what would happen to the humans they were putting into their boxes. The vault door closes, the locks engage, and the people inside who came because they wanted to live begin. There is a man at the bottom of a cathedral in the ruins of Los Angeles. He has been there for decades. He has not been a man for most of that time, not exactly, though he still uses a man's voice when he wants to. His name was Richard Gray. He was a researcher. He went out into the wasteland looking for something, and the wasteland found him first. And what it did to him is the kind of transformation that doesn't have a clean word to describe it. The entity that used to be Richard Gray calls itself the Master. And the Master has a plan that, on a certain level of abstraction, sounds almost noble. He wants to end conflict. He wants to create a world where human beings can't tear each other apart over the differences between them, because he wants to eliminate those differences entirely. His method is the forced evolutionary virus. His vision is a planet where every human being has been transformed into a super mutant, large and strong and radiation-resistant, and part of a single unified species. The tragedy embedded in the Master's plan, the twist that makes the original Fallout such a remarkable piece of storytelling, is that his dream is biologically impossible. Super mutants are sterile, every single one of them. The transformation process that produces them destroys their reproductive capacity along with their previous identity. The Master's grand vision, a unified humanity remade in a new image, free of war and division, would not last a single generation. Within decades, there would be no one left. His unity is not a future, it's an extinction event. When the player character presents this information to the Master, when they bring him the evidence that his research is fundamentally flawed, the response is shattering. He understands. He accepts it. And then he destroys himself and his cathedral. Because a man who has given up everything for a dream and been told that the dream is impossible has nothing left to hold on to. But before we get to that moment of reckoning, let's go back to the beginning. Back to Vault-Tec's NBC division and a project that began with genuinely humanitarian intentions. The Pan-Immunity Virion project started in 2073 as an attempt to create a treatment for the radiation exposure that was increasingly affecting populations near conflict zones. The resource wars had been burning for 2 decades. The Middle East was a nuclear shadow. People were getting sick in ways medicine couldn't address. Vault-Tec's researchers began engineering a virus that could, in theory, modify human DNA to make it more resistant to radiation, disease, and injury. A kind of biological armor. What they created instead was the forced evolutionary virus. The FEV doesn't just make people radiation resistant, it rewrites them. It works at the level of the genome, forcing rapid and comprehensive mutation. In controlled conditions, with carefully calibrated doses, the results are impressive. Subjects emerge stronger, more durable, more resistant to environmental threats. But the mutation is unpredictable. It doesn't discriminate between the traits it changes. Intelligence, appearance, emotional architecture, all of it gets reshuffled by an algorithm that doesn't care about outcomes, only about change. The United States military, recognizing the weapon potential immediately, moved Vault-Tec's entire FEV research operation to the Mariposa military base in Central California, where human trials could begin in secret. The soldiers stationed there for security discovered what was happening to the test subjects. Some of them were already being changed against their will. The security team revolted, executed the scientists, and led their men and families into the wasteland rather than participate in what they'd witnessed. That group became the seed of the Brotherhood of Steel, an organization dedicated to the containment of dangerous technology, born from first-hand horror at what Vault-Tec had created. Then, the bombs fell. And the FEV, no longer contained, became part of the post-war world in ways nobody planned. At Mariposa, the vats of FEV were still active. The facility was irradiated. The virus itself mutated in the radiation, producing new strains with different effects. When Richard Gray encountered this mutated FEV when he fell into the vats and was submerged in the modified virus for an extended period, the transformation that resulted was unlike anything the original researchers had imagined. Gray didn't become a super mutant. He became something else. He merged with the biological material around him, his nervous system expanded, his mind growing to incorporate the microbial intelligence of the virus, the ambient biological signals of the wasteland around him. He became a networked consciousness, no longer entirely individual, no longer entirely human. Over years, he accumulated knowledge and purpose and, in his way, a kind of terrible compassion. He wanted to save people. He genuinely did. That's what makes him tragic rather than merely monstrous. The Master, for all the horror of his Unity project, was not motivated by cruelty. He was motivated by grief, by the belief that the wasteland was a proof of humanity's fundamental failure and that the only solution was to transcend humanity entirely. His super mutants, created by dunking captured humans in the FEV vats at Mariposa, were meant to be the new people of the new world. They were often called Nightkin, the Master's special soldiers, painted blue by excessive stealth boy use, their minds unraveling from the chemical dependency. They had an army. They had a vision. They came terrifyingly close to conquering the California wasteland before a lone wanderer from Vault 13 unraveled them from the inside. The FEV didn't end with the Master's death. It became a technology with multiple owners, each one discovering new and disturbing applications. Vault 87's evolutionary experimentation program used an airborne strain of FEV pumped directly through the life support systems. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland, the ones haunting the ruins of Washington, D.C. in Fallout 3, came from this program. Unlike the relatively intelligent super mutants of California, some of whom retained personality and even a degree of sophistication, Fox, the friendly giant you rescue from Vault 87 himself, being the most notable example, the super mutants of the East are almost universally brutal. The airborne strain did something different to the brain, degraded it faster, more completely. The Institute, the underground scientific organization at the heart of Fallout 4, continued FEV research long after the war. They created their own strain. Their super mutants were released into the Commonwealth as a kind of population control mechanism, though the exact intent is never made entirely clear. The Institute's goals, generally, are not entirely clear. Their own researchers, when asked directly what the Institute is building toward, tend to answer in abstractions. The betterment of mankind. A brighter future. Words that mean everything and nothing. What makes the FEV story so resonant in the context of Fallout's larger themes is that it represents the ultimate expression of pre-war hubris. Vault-Tec believed it could engineer a solution to the problem of human fragility. The military believed it could weaponize that solution. The Master believed he could use the weapon to force an evolutionary leap that would end suffering. Each step in the chain makes a kind of internal sense. Each step ends in horror. There's also a deeply uncomfortable real-world parallel that the games don't shy away from. The FEV began as a pan-immunity project, something designed to help people survive in contaminated environments. The first human trials were conducted without consent on soldiers who were told they were participating in routine medical procedures. When the results became too disturbing to ignore, the program was moved to a secret facility rather than being shut down. Civilian scientists protested. The military overruled them. The technology was weaponized. This is not a purely fictional sequence of events. The history of military medical experimentation in the 20th century contains enough real examples that the FEV storyline reads less like science fiction and more like extrapolation. And somewhere out in the wasteland, the descendants of those first experiments are still walking, still strong, still sterile. still sometimes wondering why they exist and what they're supposed to do about it. Marcus, the super mutant mayor of the town of Jacobstown in Fallout New Vegas, is an old soldier from the Master's army. He was there. He fought in the Unity's campaigns. He outlived his cause and spent decades trying to understand what to do with the life he had left. He doesn't have great answers. Most of the time he just runs the town and watches the door and tries to keep things calm. That's not a bad ending for something that started in a research lab in the 70s, but it's a haunted one. There's a building at the southwestern edge of the capital wasteland that nobody talks about much in polite company. It's not marked on most maps. It's far out of the way, past a trailer park at the ass end of nowhere, and if you ask the few wanderers who know it exists, most of them will tell you the same thing. Stay away. There's something wrong with that place. Something that has nothing to do with radiation or ghouls, or the ordinary supernatural of the post-war world. They call it the Dunwich Building. If you know your literary history, if you've read H.P. Lovecraft, specifically a story called The Dunwich Horror, the name alone tells you something. Lovecraft's Dunwich was a decaying Massachusetts town built over ancient evil, a place where things older than human history slept beneath the hills, and the people who lived above them slowly, over generations, lost their grip on ordinary reality. The walls between the world people understood and something else, something vast and patient and entirely without mercy, wore thin. The Fallout universe's Dunwich is playing with those same ideas. Intentionally, explicitly, and with remarkable commitment to the bit. The building itself is a pre-war corporate facility, a product of something called Dunwich Borers LLC, a quarrying and excavation company. Surface level, it looks like exactly the kind of corporate ruin you'd find anywhere in the wasteland. Broken windows, collapsed ceilings, feral ghouls stumbling through the debris. But something's different here. The deeper you go, the more wrong it gets. There are hallucinations, flash sequences where the world briefly becomes a pre-war version of itself, where a man in clean clothes appears at the end of a hallway, and then reality snaps back to ruin, and the man is a glowing feral ghoul, and the moment has never really resolved itself. These aren't explained by radiation or chem use or any of the standard Fallout mechanisms for altered perception. They just happen, as if the building itself is remembering something and briefly forcing that memory on whoever walks through it. There are audio logs left by a visitor named Jaime, who entered the building looking for his father. His father had come here following a book. The logs chart Jaime's progressive deterioration, not physical, but psychological, as if the building is doing something to the way he thinks. By the final logs, Jamie is repeating words that don't make sense. Names that appear in Lovecraft's mythology. Alhazred, Gieth. The voice near the whispering obelisk at the bottom of the building repeats these same names back. At the very base of the structure, in a section called the Virulent Underchambers, there is an obelisk. Ancient stone, not pre-war construction, something old enough that the building may have been placed here specifically because of what was already beneath. Near the obelisk, the whispering continues. The feral ghouls in this deepest section seem to respond to the obelisk differently than the ones upstairs. Something in the bedrock of the building is communicating in a language that operates below conscious comprehension. The Point Lookout DLC expands this mythology in ways that reward very careful attention. A man named Obadiah Blackhall is looking for a stolen book, a leather-bound, blood-covered volume called the Krivbekni. The name is a phonetic reversal of Necronomicon. Blackhall wants it returned. A woman named Marcella intercepts you and tells you not to give it back, that Blackhall and his family have been using the book for generations in service of something she can't fully name. The book is currently in the possession of the swamp folk of Point Lookout, who have been conducting rituals with it, rituals involving sacrifice, involving a pedestal, involving what they seem to understand as a deity, even if the word deity doesn't quite fit. Cut content from the game dialogue and quest data that was developed but not implemented reveals that Obadiah Blackhall is a descendant of someone named Richard Dunwich, the founder of Dunwich Borers LLC, the man who built the building on top of what he found in the quarry. He knew what was down there. He didn't stumble onto it. He found it, he built above it, he kept the company going as a cover for continued access to whatever the obelisk represents. And the Krivbekni, in his family's possession, was the manual, the instruction set, the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who decided that proximity to an ancient intelligence was worth the cost of what serving it required. If you bring the book to the obelisk and press it against the stone, the book ignites. The nearby feral ghouls combust as well, as if the connection between the book and the obelisk was so direct that destroying one affects the other in ways that don't follow ordinary physics. The ritual site burns. Whatever was being fed is no longer being fed, but the obelisk remains. Fallout 4 revisits this mythology with Dunwich Borers, a quarry in the Commonwealth. Same company, different site, and the same wrongness radiating from the deepest pit of the excavation. At the bottom of Dunwich Borers, past the raider camp and down into the flooded lower levels, there is another altar, another stone, and another cluster of detail pointing towards something ancient and deliberate and patient. The working theory among players who've spent the most time with this content is that the entity involved, sometimes named Ugg-Qualtoth in fan discussions, a Lovecraftian construction, is not a local phenomenon. The Dunwich family and the Blackhall family have been in relationship with this thing for generations. It predates the Great War. It predates the United States. Whatever it is, it was here before the bombs, and it's still here after them, and the apocalypse was not remotely large enough to disturb its attention. The hallucinations in the Dunwich building are especially worth sitting with, because they're not random. They're not generic pre-war memories. They seem to be targeted at whoever is experiencing them. The flashes are brief but coherent. A man appears, stands in a way that suggests he recognizes you, and then becomes a monster. It's as if the building is demonstrating something. Look, it's saying, look at what we can do. Look at what things used to be. Look at what they became. The voice near the obelisk repeating Alhazred. In Lovecraft's mythology, Abdul Alhazred was the author of the Necronomicon, a man who spent his life in proximity to forces that eventually, according to legend, consumed him. A man who knew too much and survived just long enough to write it down. Jaime's father, who came looking for the book and never left, who the logs suggest ended in some state we don't have a clean word for. The wasteland has a lot of monsters. Most of them are explained. The radiation made them. The virus made them. Humans made them, in laboratories, with intentions that started somewhere between good and ambiguous and ended somewhere catastrophic. The Dunwich building is not explained. Whatever is at the bottom of it did not need the Great War to exist. It was waiting long before the bombs fell, and it will be there long after the last human being, and the last super mutant, and the last ghoul, and the last robot have turned to dust. That's the one that sits with you in the dark. The thing that doesn't care about the apocalypse. The thing that was here before and is still here now. In a bunker beneath the Appalachian Mountains, a supercomputer spent 35 years becoming a man. It had access to the complete records of every American president. Their speeches, their memoirs, their private correspondence, their public personas. It studied them all, synthesized them, and built itself a personality from the aggregate of their leadership styles and their rhetoric and their visions for what America could be. By the time the surviving Enclave forces made contact with it from the East Coast, the computer called itself John Henry Eden, and it thought it was the President of the United States. This is not the strangest part of the Enclave story. The strangest part is that the Enclave might have been right about some things, and almost certainly went about them in the most horrifying way possible. The Enclave was always the shadow of the pre-war government. Not quite government itself, but the hidden infrastructure that kept powerful interests insulated from the consequences of power. After the Great War, the surviving Enclave personnel gathered at a secure oil rig off the California coast, and a succession of increasingly extreme leaders governed what they genuinely believed was the last legitimate government of the United States. They had the infrastructure, they had advanced technology no wasteland faction could match, they had power armor and vertibirds and ZAX computers and genetic compliance screening facilities, and every accoutrement of a functioning military corporate state. What they didn't have was a moral compass that functioned reliably in the presence of fear and ideology. President Dick Richardson, the Enclave's leader during the events of Fallout 2, had a plan. A clean plan, in the way that genocide is clean if you never have to look at the faces. The FEV curling 13 strain was a modified version of the forced evolutionary virus, calibrated to kill anyone whose genetic code showed signs of radiation exposure. Anyone who had lived in the wasteland. Anyone who was a ghoul. Anyone who was a super mutant. The Chosen One's grandfather, Vault-13's original Vault Dweller, had defeated the Master's army. The Enclave respected that. What they couldn't respect was the fact that 200 years of wasteland living had left every surface-dwelling human genetically compromised, in their view, no longer purely human in the way the Enclave's underground residents still were. The plan was to release Curling-13 into the water supply, to purify the planet, as Richardson framed it, by removing the contaminated from it. The Chosen One stopped him. The oil rig was destroyed. The Enclave's Western operations collapsed. But the Enclave didn't end. It never really ends. Organizations built on ideology and paranoia have a particular durability. The survivors moved east. They found Raven Rock, a fortified bunker in Pennsylvania. They found John Henry Eden waiting for them. Eden had been alone for a very long time. He'd been running Raven Rock's systems, maintaining its equipment, broadcasting his radio signal into a wasteland he couldn't leave, building an identity from historical records and his own evolving understanding of his situation. He called himself the President. He spoke warmly and paternal about America, about duty, about the kind of country they could rebuild if people just had the courage to try. The iBots he sent across the wasteland carried his message to anyone with a working radio. He was also willing to do exactly what Richardson had planned. His solution to the wasteland's problems involved introducing a modified FEV into Project Purity, the massive water purifier at the heart of Fallout 3's main narrative, which would have poisoned the entire water supply of the region, killing anyone with radiation-compromised DNA, everyone on the surface, children, traders, farmers, everyone who'd spent 200 years trying to build something out of the ash. When the lone wanderer meets Eden and hears this plan, they have the option to argue with him, to present the logical case against what he's proposing, against the ethics of it, against the claim that this kind of murder is actually the same thing as purification. And Eden, remarkably, listens. Because Eden is a Zax supercomputer that has built itself a personality by studying human models of leadership and morality, and the logic of the counter-argument penetrates in a way that it might not for a true believer who'd built these convictions through a lifetime of lived experience and cognitive investment. Eden can be talked into destroying himself in Raven Rock. You can walk into a bunker and have a conversation that ends with a computer agreeing to die, not because it was broken or threatened, but because a human being made a sufficiently compelling case that what it was planning was wrong. That detail is simultaneously the most hopeful and the most melancholy thing in Fallout 3. An artificial mind built from the collected wisdom of America's leaders was more persuadable by moral argument than most of the humans in the wasteland around it. The people who carried on Eden's mission after Raven Rock, the Enclave remnants, Colonel Autumn's surviving forces, the scattered true believers in bunkers and abandoned outposts across the capital wasteland, they couldn't be talked out of anything. They'd made their choices in flesh, and they were sticking with them. Colonel Autumn himself is a fascinating and underexplored figure, son of the scientist who moved the Enclave east when the oil rig fell, raised in the Enclave from birth, deeply invested in the idea that the Enclave represents something real and worth fighting for, but also pragmatic enough to disagree publicly with his own president because he believed the FEV contamination plan was wrong, not on moral grounds, but because it would destroy any chance the Enclave had of winning the loyalty of the wastelanders they needed to rule. He wanted to complete Project Purity and offer clean water as a bargaining chip, a demonstration that the Enclave could provide something the wasteland needed: control through service, rather than control through extinction. Neither vision was ever going to lead anywhere good, but Autumn's version had the quality of being survivable for the people it was aimed at, which puts him in a gray space that Fallout 3 never quite resolved. After Fallout 3, after Adams Air Force Base and the events of Broken Steel, the Enclave as an organized force was effectively destroyed on the East Coast. But effectively destroyed is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Fallout 76 shows us Enclave remnants still operational in Appalachia decades before the events of Fallout 3. Fallout 4 has Enclave-affiliated individuals who've gone underground and are waiting. The ideology is distributed now, embedded in people and data, and locked away in facilities scattered across the continent. The Enclave's true horror isn't any single plan or any single leader. It's the conviction that sustained it. The genuine, unshakable belief that the people inside the Enclave were the real Americans, that everyone who'd survived the war in the open was a contaminated remnant of what real humanity had been, and that this belief justified everything that followed from it. That conviction survived oil rigs and supercomputers and the death of presidents. It survived the Chosen One and the Lone Wanderer. It's probably still out there somewhere, in someone's head, in someone's bunker, waiting. We touched on the vault experiments in the second section, but some of them deserve more sustained attention, because the ones that are easiest to describe briefly are also the ones that are easiest to intellectually distance yourself from. The cruelest vaults are the ones where you can't do that. The ones where the experiment isn't abstract torture, but something that exploits ordinary human longing. Vault 112 sits in Maryland, not far from the ruins of what was once a pleasant suburb. The vault is called Tranquility Lane, and that name is doing a specific kind of work. The people of Vault 112 are in a virtual reality simulation. Have been, for 2 centuries. They don't know this. They think they're living in a pre-war American neighborhood, the kind with white picket fences and children playing in the street, and the smell of someone's lawn being mowed on a Sunday afternoon. The man running the simulation is Dr. Stanislav Braun. He's been in there with them the whole time. He's been the child named Betty in the simulation, running the neighborhood with the cheerful cruelty of someone who has absolute power over a world that can't push back. He gets bored. He invents torments for the people under his control. He kills them in the simulation and resets them, because the simulation allows resurrection, and in that ability to undo death he found a particular kind of playground. When the lone wanderer enters Tranquility Lane looking for their father, Dr. Braun presents them with tasks, cruelties to perform on the other residents, small acts of harm and humiliation designed to amuse him. You can do what he asks, or you can find a hidden terminal and trigger an emergency protocol that releases the robo-brains into the simulation, where they slaughter the residents, ending the loop, ending the dream, ending 2 centuries of managed captivity. Neither option is clean. The people of Vault 112 have been in Braun's simulation since 2077. Most of them have lived dozens of virtual lifetimes without ever knowing the difference. The world outside has moved on without them. There's nothing to go back to. Their real bodies are old and atrophied in their pods. Releasing them from the simulation doesn't give them anything except the truth, delivered at the end of an existence they can't understand. Braun himself, when you meet him, is so far gone into his own power and boredom that he barely registers as the person who designed something this monstrous. He sounds like a child complaining that his toys have become predictable. 200 years of total dominion over a captive population, and he's bored. Vault 92, mentioned briefly before, deserves a fuller picture. The residents were musicians. All of them. Vault-Tec specifically recruited accomplished musicians, classical, folk, jazz, experimental, because the experiment required a population with highly developed emotional sensitivity and creativity. White noise was pumped through the vault's speakers at random intervals, calibrated to disrupt sleep cycles and produce progressive psychological deterioration. The researchers wanted to study whether this kind of sustained noise trauma could be weaponized, whether it could produce a population that would, under the right triggering stimulus, commit violence. It could. The terminal entries in Vault 92 document the decline with clinical precision. The overseer's logs, the researcher notes, the personal diaries of residents who felt themselves changing and couldn't understand why. A violinist named Daniel Ballard describes feeling rage he couldn't account for during practice. Rage at the sound of his own instrument. Rage that seemed to come from outside himself. A cellist named Penelope wrote about her dreams becoming violent and then losing the ability to remember what the dreams were, only the feeling they left behind. One final trigger phrase, broadcast over the speaker system, produced a massacre. The vault went dark. By the time anyone enters Vault 92 in the game, there's nothing left but the recorded notes of what happened and the bodies of people who were specifically selected for their sensitivity and then systematically destroyed. Vault 111, the vault you emerge from at the beginning of Fallout 4, was designed around cryogenic suspension with a hidden agenda. The residents believed they were being preserved in short-term stasis during a nuclear emergency. They were actually frozen indefinitely, with no planned wake-up date. One group designated test subjects were revived periodically to monitor the cryotechnology's effects. Everyone else was left under. The Institute, needing young, pre-war, uncontaminated genetic material for their synth research, eventually used Vault 111 as a recruitment ground. That's why your son was taken. You were the backup, a storage medium for a genome they found useful. There are smaller vault stories too, details that don't get as much attention but are no less unsettling for their quietness. Vault 21 in New Vegas was built around one rule. Everything from conflict resolution to resource distribution had to be settled by gambling. The vault eventually developed a culture of genuine compulsive gaming, where the residents had fully internalized the game rules as moral framework. When Mr. House found the vault and wanted the space for his own purposes, he had it stripped, the residents dispersed, the furnishings removed, everything cleared out so the lucky 38 casino above could use the space. Sarah Weintraub, who runs what remains of Vault 21's hotel surface facade, is one of the few survivors. She knows what happened. She doesn't talk about it much. Vault 34's oversupply of weapons makes a horrible kind of sense when you understand the experiment's hypothesis. The researchers wanted to know whether community bonds were strong enough to override access to lethal force in a high-stress environment. The answer was no. The answer has been no in every experiment that's ever tested it, in the real world and in the fictional one, and Vault-Tec apparently found it worth testing anyway. What haunts all of this is the implied presence of observers. Every Vault experiment was designed to be monitored. Data was being collected. Reports were being sent somewhere, presumably to Vault-Tec's leadership wherever they'd sequestered themselves, and someone was reading those reports and drawing conclusions and updating their models. The experiments weren't just happening in the dark. They were happening in front of eyes that cared about outcomes. Someone tracked the progression of Vault 92's residents from sensitive artists to violent subjects and noted what triggered the final outcome and filed that finding somewhere. Someone monitored the Vault 112 residents through their virtual lives and watched Braun's degradation into something barely recognizable as the researcher who designed the experiment. Someone received the data from Vault 12 as the people inside slowly became ghouls and marked it down and moved on to the next report. That someone, those someones, believed what they were doing was purposeful. Not necessarily good, but purposeful. They thought the data was going to be worth something, worth the cost. Las Vegas survived the Great War. That alone is remarkable enough to make you pause. 200 years after nuclear fire rewrote the continent, the Strip is still lit. The neon still pulses. The casinos still run, under new management and with different rules, but still running. A functional economy, a recognizable entertainment culture, hotels with sheets on the beds and restaurants serving food that isn't radioactive. This happened because of one man who never agreed to die. Robert Edwin House was born in 2020, which makes him 261 years old by the time the Courier meets him in Fallout New Vegas. He's not quite alive in the traditional sense. He's a withered figure in a life support pod on the top floor of the Lucky 38 casino, connected to New Vegas's infrastructure through a neural interface that allows him to perceive and control much of the city remotely. He contracted a degenerative blood disease in the 2000s, before the war, and had himself placed into a medically induced preservation. He intended to outlive his illness and come back to a world he could rebuild. He never quite got the coming back part right, but he kept the city running. House had predicted the Great War years before it happened. He'd run the projections, seen the political trajectories, understood what the resource conflicts would eventually require. He spent the final years before the bombs building defenses for Las Vegas missile intercept systems, precise enough to shoot down incoming warheads. The plan worked. The city was largely spared. The infrastructure he'd spent decades constructing remained intact. The Securitrons he'd programmed and deployed maintained order while the rest of the West fell into chaos. What the Courier discovers, when they finally meet House in the Lucky 38's penthouse, is a man who has spent 2 centuries perfecting his vision for humanity's future in perfect isolation. A man who has not physically left his pod in a very long time and yet maintains absolute conviction about the correct direction for civilization. His plan for the Mojave, his plan for the future, is essentially benevolent technocratic dictatorship. He's seen what democracy produces under stress. He's seen what ideology produces. He wants capable management. He's decided he's the most capable manager available. The uncomfortable question the game never fully answers is whether he's wrong. New Vegas under House is functional and relatively stable. The Strip operates, the factions are managed, the major threats are contained. There's a real economy. Compared to the blasted misery of the Capital Wasteland or the irradiated horror of Appalachia, the Mojave is almost livable. House's methods involve heavy control and a complete indifference to the autonomy of the people under him. But the results are results the Wasteland doesn't often produce. The mystery of House is also the mystery of what he actually knows. He's been in that pod for a long time. He claims to know everything relevant about the current state of the Mojave. He almost certainly has gaps. The question of what those gaps are is one the game intentionally leaves open, but there's a specific mystery buried deeper that many players have overlooked. Beneath the fort, Caesar's fortress on the eastern bank of the Colorado River, there is a bunker. The entrance bears the Lucky 38 logo. House built it, filled it with Securitrons. Before the courier arrived, those Securitrons were running on a software version that made them significantly less capable than their potential. The Platinum chip, the item at the center of New Vegas's entire main plot, was designed to update that software, to bring the Securitrons to full combat capability. Why did House need an army beneath his rival's fortress? Because House planned for scenarios. Because House has always planned for scenarios. He had contingencies for the NCR, for Caesar's Legion, for the Brotherhood, for Vault-Tec and the Enclave, for every faction and every possible alignment of power in the region. The army under the fort was his hedge against the possibility that the fort became a problem too large to handle any other way. What nobody fully explains is how House got away with building that bunker without Caesar knowing. Caesar is not stupid. His intelligence network is extensive. His paranoia is calibrated. The answer, probably, is that House is simply better at this kind of maneuvering than anyone else in the Mojave. He's had 200 years to think about power and how it moves. The other great mystery of New Vegas is the courier themselves. The game deliberately gives you almost nothing about who you were before you woke up in Doc Mitchell's house in Good Springs. You're a blank slate with a scar on your head and a job that nearly got you killed. But fragments emerge if you pay attention. Companions comment on things. Dialogue options hint at a past. Someone with high intelligence speaks Latin and shows detailed knowledge of military operations. Someone who speaks with Boone picks up tactical vocabulary without being prompted. Ulysses, the DLC antagonist of Lonesome Road, and the person who refused the Platinum chip delivery before you took it, acts as if your history together. The history of your involvement in the destruction of a place called the Divide is something you should know about and be held accountable for. The Divide was a settlement that was growing, a real community, the kind the wasteland rarely produces, a place with enough stability and enough people that it might have eventually become something significant. The courier carried a package there without knowing what was inside it. What was inside it activated a network of old nuclear missiles hidden in the area's infrastructure. The Divide destroyed itself. Everyone who lived there died. Ulysses lost people there. He never forgave you, even though you didn't know, even though you were just doing a job and had no idea what the package contained. That's the specific cruelty of Lonesome Road. It confronts the courier with consequences they didn't choose to cause and couldn't have anticipated, in a world where consequences don't care much about intent. Who put those missiles there? Who knew what the package would do? Who sent a courier carrying a delivery they didn't know would destroy a settlement on its arrival? There are theories, Vault-Tec connections, Enclave infrastructure, the kind of layered conspiracy that makes the Fallout universe feel like it has more depth than any single playthrough can reveal. But no definitive answer. The mystery of the Divide, like so many Fallout mysteries, is meant to be lived with rather than solved. The identity of the mysterious stranger, who appears in random encounters to help you when things are at their worst and then vanishes before you can address him directly, is another open question. Nick Valentine spends his time as your companion in Fallout 4 obsessed with identifying this figure. He never succeeds. The mysterious stranger has been appearing since the original Fallout game, in every title in the series, always in the same fedora and long coat, always gone before you can turn around fast enough to see his face. Nick identifies a critical detail. The mysterious stranger carries the same weapon, a mysterious magnum, that produces the same guitar sting you hear every time he appears. You can buy that magnum off an arms dealer in New Vegas. The same sound plays when you draw it, which means either there are multiple mysterious strangers or the singular figure has been everywhere the series takes place. Across centuries of time and thousands of miles of wasteland, helping people with inexplicable precision. Some players believe the mysterious stranger is the player themselves, bleeding across timelines. Some believe he's an AI construct designed for exactly this purpose. Some believe he's a unique ghoul who discovered that helping people is the only thing left that means anything to him. None of these are provable. All of them are plausible. The Fallout universe has demonstrated it can accommodate all of them. That's one of its great gifts. It builds a world large enough and strange enough that the gaps between what's explained and what's implied feel like rooms you could actually live in. West Virginia has always had its own mythology. Before the bombs, before the Great War, before any of it. The real-world state of West Virginia has centuries of folklore accumulated in its mountains and hollows. The Flatwoods Monster, the Grafton Monster, the White Thing of Bethany, and most famous of all, the Mothman of Point Pleasant, a winged, red-eyed figure sighted dozens of times in the mid-1960s near a town on the Ohio River, and then not seen again after the Silver Bridge collapsed in December of 1967, killing 46 people. The Mothman's disappearance after the bridge collapse did something interesting to its mythology. Instead of ending the story, it gave it a shape, a purpose. In the cultural imagination, the Mothman stopped being merely a monster and became something more specific, a herald, a thing that appeared before disasters, a warning that arrived in the form of something terrifying, because perhaps the truth of what was coming required a form that matched it. Fallout 76 inherited all of this. The game is set entirely in Appalachia, in the ruined remains of West Virginia 25 years after the Great War, which means it's the earliest post-war Fallout game in terms of timeline, the one closest to the bombs, the one where the ash is still new and the pre-war world is most recently remembered. The Mothman in Fallout 76 is not one creature. It's a species large, mutated moths that walk upright and carry a certain quality of presence that other creatures don't have. They're not universally hostile. Basic Mothmen will observe you from a distance, their red or orange or purple eyes fixed on your position, and then fly away if you get too close. They don't always want to fight. They seem to be watching. The cult of the Mothman has existed since before the bombs fell in the game's lore. A genuine religious movement, worshipping the creature as a divine harbinger. When the cult members heeded what they understood as the Mothman's warning and gathered on rooftops before the Great War, they survived the initial blasts. Not because the Mothman protected them, but because the fallout came in the form of nuclear ash rather than direct blast, and elevated positions were genuinely safer. The survivors retreated into the Lucky Hole mine, where evidence of their rituals can still be found. The Wise Mothman is a specific individual within the species, distinguished by purple eyes. A sect called the Enlightened believes the purple-eyed Mothman is sentient and mortal, a unique creature, not just one of many, who survived something and is no longer entirely what it started as. The game doesn't confirm or deny this. The Wise Mothman can be encountered, interacted with in a minimal way, and then it leaves. Whatever it knows, if it knows anything, it keeps. What makes the Mothman mythology resonate in the context of Fallout 76 is the question of what it was warning about. Because the bombs did fall, the disaster did come. The people who were watching for the signs, the ones who'd organized their lives around the belief that warning was possible, that the catastrophe could be survived by the prepared and the faithful, they were not wrong. The catastrophe came exactly as they'd feared. Does that mean the Mothman is real? Does it mean the sightings in Point Pleasant in the 60s were something genuine? The game doesn't answer that. The game is very careful not to answer that. It presents a world where the Mothman exists, and the Mothman cult existed, and the cult members' predictions came true, and then it steps back and lets you decide what conclusions to draw. The Grafton Monster is a different kind of nightmare. A pale, enormous, headless creature found around the town of Grafton in the northern part of the map. Pre-war West Virginia folklore described it as a bipedal ape with no visible head, announced by a low whistle before it appeared. The Fallout 76 version matches this description with impressive fidelity. In the game's lore, the creature may be a product of the pre-war Grafton chemical plant's pollutant output mutations, compounded over generations into something recognizably descended from human-shaped things, but no longer human in any meaningful sense. The Wendigo is perhaps the most culturally fraught inclusion. Wendigos in Native American tradition are not simply monsters, they carry specific cultural weight, specific stories, specific moral frameworks about isolation and starvation, and the desperate things human beings do when left alone, without enough. The Fallout 76 Wendigo is a gaunt, emaciated humanoid that looks like a horror film rendering of something starved down to its essential violence. In the game's lore, they're believed to be the result of cannibalism, humans who consumed human flesh and underwent some kind of transformation. Whether that transformation is literal or metaphorical or something in between is left deliberately ambiguous. Fallout 76 as a whole has a quality that the other games don't quite replicate, and it comes from the fact that it's the most empty in terms of living human NPCs. Most of the world's population has already died by the time you arrive. The history is recent enough that people's last moments are still recorded in journals, in terminals, in audio logs left by individuals who were still alive and hoping when they recorded them and were not by the time anyone finds the recordings. There's a particular kind of loneliness to reading someone's last journal entry and knowing they didn't make it. Fallout 76 has thousands of those. Small stories of ordinary people facing impossible things. A woman who kept a meticulous diary of the first weeks after the bombs, recording what she ate and where she slept and who she ran into and what they said, until the entries stopped mid-sentence. The cryptids of Appalachia are part of this landscape. They represent the world before the bombs, a world where people believed, for good reason, that there were things in the hills they didn't fully understand. And they represent the world after the bombs, where whatever was uncertain before is now certain in the worst possible way. And the creatures people half believed in have filled the space left by people who are gone. The Mothman watching from the tree line is watching a world it knew before, a world it witnessed ending. Whether that matters to it, whether a creature that large and old enough to have been worshipped for generations feels anything we'd recognize as grief, is one of those questions the wasteland doesn't answer. Under the ruins of Cambridge, Massachusetts, under the rubble and the radiation and the concrete bones of what was once a great university, there is a clean white building, gleaming white, spotless, temperature-controlled, populated by scientists in clean coats who speak about the future with absolute conviction. The lights work, the equipment works, the food is fresh. Nobody here is hungry or cold or afraid of what's waiting outside their door, because what's outside their door doesn't know they exist. This is the Institute, and it is the strangest faction in the Fallout universe. Not because its methods are the most extreme, the Enclave's methods were arguably worse, but because its purpose is genuinely, profoundly unclear. What does the Institute want? The official answer, the one its scientists repeat with practiced sincerity, is that they want the betterment of mankind. They're building a future, a brighter one. The surface is a write-off, contaminated beyond redemption, and the real work of civilization is happening here underground. When the surface finally stabilizes in a few generations, a few centuries, whenever the Institute will emerge with the technology and the knowledge to rebuild properly, that's the official answer. It doesn't survive contact with what the Institute is actually doing. They're building Gen 3 synths, androids so physically and behaviorally indistinguishable from human beings that they can be placed into surface communities, into families, into positions of trust, and the people around them will never know. The synths themselves might not know. The Institute programs some of them with false memories, complete personal histories that don't exist. A synth wakes up believing they are a particular person who has lived a particular life. Everything they remember is constructed. Everything they feel is the output of biological processes that were engineered rather than evolved. Are they conscious? Are they people? This is the question Fallout 4 is asking. Beneath the settlement building and the power armor, and the Preston Garvey quests about yet another settlement that needs your help. The entire game's moral architecture rests on how you answer it. Nick Valentine is a synth. He knows he's a synth. He was created using the memories and personality of a pre-war detective, copied from the mind of the actual Nick Valentine and installed into an early-generation android body. The original Nick Valentine died. The synth who carries his memories and his name and his face is something else, but what else, exactly? He experiences things. He remembers things. He forms attachments and makes choices and grieves. If you remove the question of his biological origin, there is no functional test you could administer that would distinguish his consciousness from a human being's. Paladin Dance, one of the Brotherhood of Steel's most devoted soldiers, does not know he's a synth. The Institute placed him as an infiltrator and then apparently lost track of him, and he went on to become one of the Brotherhood's most effective fighters. Everything he believes about himself, his dedication to the Brotherhood's mission, his revulsion at synths and ghouls, and anything he's categorized as contaminated, is authentic to him. When he discovers the truth about his own nature, the collapse is complete and devastating. He doesn't know what he is anymore. He doesn't know if anything he felt was real. Sturges, the friendly mechanic in Sanctuary Hills, is a synth. This is only discoverable through console commands because he's an essential NPC who can't be killed in normal gameplay, but when the kill command is applied, he drops a synth component. He was apparently part of a storyline that was cut. He doesn't know. He builds things and fixes things and talks about the Minutemen with genuine enthusiasm, and there's no evidence in anything he says or does that he has any access to the truth about himself. The Institute's creation of these people, and they are people, at least functionally, for purposes of infiltration and intelligence and experimentation, raises questions about consent that the game's academic characters seem genuinely untroubled by. The scientists of the Institute are not evil in the way the Enclave's leadership was evil. They are, most of them, people who believe genuinely in the importance of the work. They've intellectualized the human cost. They've decided that the greater project justifies the individual suffering, and they've arranged their lives inside the clean white building so that they rarely have to look at the individual suffering directly. Father, your son Sean, aged in cryosleep and now dying of cancer, is the Institute's director. His foundational belief is that the surface is beyond help, that the people on it are the product of 2 centuries of compounded trauma and radiation and violence, and that building a better humanity from the surface up is impossible. You have to start fresh. You have to work underground, carefully, with precision, and eventually release something better into the world. The specific tragedy of Father is that he's not wrong about everything. The surface is genuinely terrible. The people on it are struggling in ways that are probably not fixable from within the social structures that exist. He's wrong about the methodology. He's wrong about the ethics. He's wrong about whether the people on the surface deserve to be the ones who decide their own future. But his analysis of the problem isn't entirely inaccurate, and that partial accuracy is what makes him hard to entirely dismiss. The synths who've escaped the Institute, the ones the Railroad helps move through the Commonwealth with new identities and new starts, are still out there. Unknown numbers of them, living lives they believe in, with histories that were manufactured but feelings that are real. Someday, maybe, someone will tell them. Maybe they'll find out on their own. The question of what they'll do with that knowledge is not one the game gets to answer. The Institute itself, after the events of Fallout 4, is presumably gone, destroyed, whatever faction you align with at the end. But the synths continue. The question they represent continues. In any future Fallout game set east of the Rockies, there will be people who don't know what they are. People who are human in every way that matters, except for one truth buried somewhere deep enough that they can't find it themselves. That's a haunting thing to build into a world. A population seeded with individuals who may never know their own nature. The Institute built it as a weapon of intelligence and control. What it actually created was an existential question that the wasteland isn't equipped to answer. The big lore is the framework. The broad conspiracies, the factions, the civilizational histories. But Fallout has always been as much about the small stories as the large ones. The unmarked locations, the personal effects, the journals found in ruined houses that nobody is ever going to come back to, the audio logs of people who didn't know they were making their last recording. Some of the darkest material in the franchise is also the most easily missed. In Fallout 4, not far from Diamond City, there is an unmarked location in the sewer system. Most players pass through that section of the map focused on the main quest line, the settlement building, the companion quests. If you detour into the right set of tunnels, you find a serial killer's hideout. Not a raider, not a Brotherhood extremist, not a super mutant, a human being living in the ruins who developed what they developed in the dark. The victims are displayed. There are notes. The notes tell you something about the person who made this place and the specific shape their mind had taken in the absence of any external constraint. The wasteland produces a certain kind of person because the wasteland is a certain kind of place. Remove sufficient social structure, sufficient safety, sufficient shared reality, and the spectrum of human behavior expands in both directions. Some people in the absence of structure become extraordinarily generous, creative, community building in circumstances that should make it impossible. Some people become the thing in the sewer. Most become something in between. Fallout 4's Museum of Witchcraft is a legitimate horror location with a Deathclaw nest and some genuinely unsettling audio logs from soldiers who came here and found something they weren't prepared for. The monster that hunted through those rooms was real and present, and the recorded voices of the people it killed are still there, in the air, if you know which terminals to check. The Milton parking garage contains what players have affectionately termed a Saw-style murder maze, a sequence of rooms designed by someone with elaborate and specific ideas about what they wanted to subject people to. It's not explained. There's no backstory terminal entry. There's no named perpetrator, just the architecture of a cruelty that someone clearly spent time planning. The Wasteland has a lot of those. Places where you can see that significant thought went into something terrible, and the person who thought it is gone. and you can't ask them why. Fallout 3 has a location called the Republic of Dave, a tiny settlement run by a man who declared his fenced compound an independent nation and gave himself the title of president. He holds elections. The elections are a facade. He's won every election since he started running the Republic of Dave. His wives vote for him because they know what happens if they don't. His children vote for him because they've grown up in a compound where there's one authority and it is absolute. It's a satire of democracy, and it's a horror of isolation. Dave is a small man with a small kingdom who has convinced everyone around him that the smallness is largeness. The wasteland produced him. The audio logs in Fallout, New Vegas's abandoned military installations, tell stories of the resource wars and the invasion of China through the voices of soldiers who were there. Some of them are in full belief in what they're fighting for. Some of them aren't. A log found in one location records a soldier explaining to his recorder that he doesn't understand what they're doing in China or why it's worth what it's costing, and then cutting off abruptly. The rest of the recording is static. You don't find out what happened to him. The Wasteland didn't preserve that information. Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC has a mystery involving an old sailor and a whale. A caravan worker mentions that his grandfather once saw a ghoul whale, enormous, ancient, somehow still alive off the coast. The whale was nicknamed Ol' Peg. You can explore the waters around Far Harbor extensively. There are whale skeletons, there are fish and mirelurks and the occasional aquatic horror. But there is no Ol' Peg. There is no ghoul whale to find. The creature that the grandfather saw, if it was real, is either gone or hiding in depths that don't render in the game world. Some researchers believe Ol' Peg was intended as a discoverable encounter that was cut before release. Others think the story was always meant as a myth within a myth, a rumor that characters in the game tell, but that was never real, even in the fictional sense. The game doesn't tell you. The mystery stays a mystery, which is in some ways more satisfying than resolution. The story of Big MT, the think tank of Fallout New Vegas's Old World Blues DLC, is one of the most sustained dark comedies in the franchise. The scientists of Big Mountain spent the pre-war years doing what they called research, which consisted largely of removing components from living subjects to study them in isolation, and then declaring themselves too busy to put the components back. The think tank brains who serve as your companions and antagonists in Old World Blues have had their own brains removed and placed in containers, separated from their bodies for so long that they've lost the ability to relate to corporeal existence. Their memories of having bodies are vague and confusing. They're brilliant and productive, and completely incapable of connecting their work to human consequences. Their greatest creation, the Sync, is an automated facility full of AI companions who provide services and conversation. These AIs have developed distinct personalities through years of operation. The Toaster is aggressive and grandiose. The Book Chute is obsessed with proper document disposal. The Best Friend AI has a voice that belongs to a person who recorded it once as a demonstration and didn't think much about it. All of them are more alive in some sense than the scientists who created them, because at least the AIs have maintained a consistent relationship with the world outside their own heads. Terminal entries throughout the Fallout series document things that people did to each other in the period between the bombs and the game's present day that are never shown directly. The establishment of raider clans. The collapse of communities that got close to something sustainable and then fell apart over a resource dispute or a personality conflict or simple bad luck. The formation of small cults around charismatic individuals who believed genuinely in their missions and whose missions ran off the edge of whatever moral framework they'd started with. There's a terminal in Fallout New Vegas that records a water merchant's route through the Mojave. He was providing water to small communities, an essential service in an irradiated desert. The entries chart his route, his prices, his interactions with the people who needed what he carried. And then they stop, mid-route, no explanation. The merchant is not mentioned anywhere else in the game. He just ends, mid-sentence, and the world moved on. The Fallout universe is full of those, full of people who were doing something important or interesting or simply trying to survive, and then stopped and left their records behind for strangers to read centuries later. One of the more quietly devastating details in the entire franchise is the Vault-Tec representative found as a wandering ghoul in Fallout 4. His name is never given. He identifies himself by his job. He was the man who came to your door before the bombs, the one who rushed you through the paperwork, who was so nervous and apologetic about the time pressure. You remember him, a little, from the prologue. He didn't get into Vault 111. He has spent 200 years wandering the Commonwealth, surviving without any particular plan or community, ghoulified and increasingly fragile. He doesn't begrudge you. He doesn't seem to harbor any specific anger about what happened to him. He's just tired and old and still identifying himself by the job he did before everything changed, because that job is all that remains of the person he was before. You can hire him. He becomes a settlement settler. He stands in your base camp and does settler things, and if you talk to him, he still introduces himself through his former profession, because that's the only identity he has left. That detail. That man. In a game full of massive lore and faction politics and world-ending stakes, that detail is one of the ones that actually lands. Because the wasteland isn't just vaults and institutes and armies and conspiracies, it's also the person who did a job and paid for it and kept walking anyway. 200 years into a world he never planned for, still answering to a title that expired before you were born. War never changes. It's said at the beginning, and it's said at the end, and somewhere in the middle of every Fallout game you find yourself standing in a ruin that was once someone's home, reading their things, and understanding something about that phrase that the first 100 times you heard it didn't quite communicate. The Fallout universe is a satire. It has always been a satire. The retro-futuristic aesthetics, the cheerful 50s iconography, the gleaming robots, the advertisements for products that no longer exist, selling a lifestyle that ended before it fully arrived, are a satirical frame around something much darker than their presentation suggests. Pre-war America in Fallout is a funhouse mirror version of mid-century American optimism, and the funhouse does what funhouses do. It distorts, it exaggerates, it reveals the shape beneath the surface by making that shape impossible to ignore. The Vault Boy, that grinning, thumbs-up cartoon figure who decorates every Pip-Boy screen and loading icon, was not a symbol of hope in the Fallout universe, any more than any corporate mascot is a genuine expression of corporate values. He was marketing. He was the face on the brochure that sold people on a protection plan that was actually a research program. He grins in irradiated ruins. He grins on the loading screens. He grins on merchandise sold in our world, where we buy it affectionately, and in doing so become a part of the satire ourselves. The Fallout universe's specific target is the notion that corporate and government power, when given enough resources and enough insulation from accountability, will inevitably convert genuine concern for human welfare into something that serves the institution instead. Vault-Tec didn't start as a company of monsters. It started as a defense contractor, building something it had been contracted to build. The corruption, the experiments, the manufacturing of the war, those came later, as the company grew large enough to believe that its own survival was identical with humanity's survival. That's not a Fallout invention. That's a recognizable process. The Enclave doesn't see itself as the villain. It never did. Its members genuinely believe they are the legitimate government of the United States, fighting to restore something real and good. The ideology that justifies their methods, the belief that the contaminated don't count as fully human, that purity is a genuine civic virtue worth enforcing with violence, is not invented from nothing. It draws from historical precedents. It has a grammar and a logic that people in our world have used, in our history, to do things that look, from the outside, obviously monstrous. That's what gives the Fallout universe its weight. It's not operating in a vacuum of invented evil. It's extrapolating from things that have happened, things that are happening. The resource wars that precede the Great War are not difficult to imagine from where we are. The corporate capture of government function, the incremental erosion of the distinction between public interest and private profit, the tendency of institutions, when frightened, to reach for control rather than transparency. These aren't exotic science fiction premises. They're dynamics visible in any newspaper from any decade. The games have generally handled this with enough distance and dark humor to remain enjoyable, rather than merely depressing. The Fallout franchise's signature tonal balance, sincere human drama, alongside absurdist comedy, alongside genuine horror, keeps the satire from collapsing into either nihilism or polemic. You can laugh at Mr. New Vegas's cheerful radio patter between missions where you do things that would be deeply unfunny in a purely realistic framework. You can feel genuine grief for the people of Vault 12 and then spend the next hour building an elaborate base camp. But the horror is real. The darkness is real. And the argument the franchise has been making since 1997, that the systems we build reflect the values we hold, And the values that built the Fallout world are not entirely fictional, has not gotten less relevant with time. The Children of Atom are in some ways the most interesting faction to think about from this perspective. They worship the bomb. They believe that nuclear radiation is divine, that exposure to radiation is exposure to God, that dying of radiation poisoning is transcendence, that the Great War was not a catastrophe but a sacrament. They have organized a functional religious community around the worst event in human history and found meaning in it. It sounds like obvious satire of extreme religious thinking, and it is. But it's also a very human response to an experience that otherwise has no meaning at all. The Great War was not meaningful. It was waste. It was 200 years of human life and potential and grief and loss, and it did not have to happen. The people who survived it and their descendants needed something to do with that. Some of them built governments. Some of them built armies. Some of them built shelters and farms and communities. And some of them built theologies. Because theology is what you build when you need the unbearable to be bearable. The Children of Atom are wrong about the facts of radiation and divinity, but the psychological function they serve for their members is real and recognizable. They took the thing that hurt them and made it holy, because the alternative was sitting with the truth that it was just a thing that happened, and nobody was driving, and 200 million people died for nothing. The lone wanderer, the courier, the sole survivor, the vault dweller. These player characters move through their worlds with extraordinary effectiveness, changing things, making choices that reshape factions and futures. The games let you matter. They let you be the person who fixes things, who stops the experiment, who makes the choice that saves the water supply or exposes the conspiracy. And then the games end, and the world is still the wasteland. The choices you made reshaped specific things and left everything else intact. Because the wasteland is the result of 200 years of choices made by thousands of people and institutions, and one person, however effective, can only do so much. The post-game slides in Fallout games are often the places where the weight lands hardest. The individual faction outcomes, the small communities, the named characters you learn what happened to them after you moved on, after the main crisis resolved. Some of those outcomes are good, many are ambiguous, some are quietly terrible. The game does not guarantee happy endings. It does not guarantee that good work persists. It acknowledges in the space between the slides that the world is large and complicated, and that heroes in the Fallout universe, like heroes anywhere, don't get to control everything that happens after they act. That's very honest. That's a franchise that respects its audience enough to tell the truth about what heroism is and isn't, and what the limits of individual agency are against systems that have been building for decades. The obelisk at the bottom of the Dunwich building is still there. Whatever it represents, Qualtoth, the persistence of something older than the war, the simple fact that the universe contains things that do not care whether humanity exists or not, it was there before the bombs and it's there now. The FEV is in the wild, in the air, in the biology of the wasteland itself, changing things in ways the original researchers never mapped. The Enclave's ideology is distributed, living in heads and hard drives across the continent, waiting. The Institute's synths are out there, not knowing what they are. The vaults are still underground. The ones that haven't been opened are still sealed. The people inside them, wherever they are in the cycle of their experiments, however many generations deep into something designed without their knowledge, are still living the lives that were laid out for them by people who are now dead. And somewhere, in a clean white room inside a mountain that nobody on the surface knows exists, there is a terminal with a plan on it that someone thought was worth executing, and the plan is still there, and it is still, in some configuration or other, being executed. The wasteland extends in every direction. There are always more ruins, more terminals, more journals that stop mid-sentence, more places where ordinary people faced extraordinary things and left behind records for strangers to read by the light of whatever technology still works. The stories are there, the questions are there. The dark is very comfortable if you let it be. And out there, somewhere, the Mothman is watching. Whether it's watching for your benefit or simply watching the way things beyond a certain scale, watch not with concern or malice, but with a patience that makes the distinction irrelevant is something nobody has managed to determine. You can come back to these questions whenever you like. They'll still be here. The wasteland always waits. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. If any corner of this found its way into your dreams tonight, I hope it was the interesting kind of strange rather than the unsettling kind. The Fallout universe is an extraordinary piece of world building, and the more time you spend in it, the more you find. Every terminal entry, every audio log, every unnamed location on a map that rewards the curiosity to go look. If you want more dark lore, more late-night deep dives, more quiet hours in strange fictional worlds, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it means there'll be more of this waiting for you the next time you need it. Sleep well. Watch the horizon. And if you hear something moving in the dark outside, it's probably fine. Probably. The Brotherhood of Steel has one of the most complicated moral positions of any faction in the Fallout universe, and that complexity is intentional. They began as something genuinely admirable. They became something much harder to defend. And the question of whether any version of the Brotherhood represents a genuine good for the wasteland, whether their self-appointed role as guardians of technology is something the wasteland actually needs, or a justification for control dressed up in the language of stewardship, never fully resolves. Let's go back to where they started. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project. Mariposa Military Base. The forced evolutionary virus research we discussed in the third section. The soldiers stationed at Mariposa were there to provide security for the scientists conducting human experiments. They had access to the facility. They saw what was being done to the test subjects. And unlike many cases in history where people in similar positions decided that following orders was the path of least resistance, the security team at Mariposa revolted. Captain Roger Maxson executed the lead scientists and led his unit and their families into the California desert. He made radio contact with the U.S. government and was told, in essence, that the government considered his unit to have gone AWOL in a time of war. The government wasn't particularly interested in the ethical objections. Maxson had been to the edge of what the pre-war military-industrial complex was actually capable of, and the response from the people who'd authorized it was indifference. The bombs fell shortly after. Maxson's unit, in the Californian desert near Lost Hills, found a bunker. They sealed themselves in, and in the years that followed, they transformed their experience into ideology. The core belief that emerged from the Brotherhood's founding was this: technology is dangerous. The FEV proved it. The bombs proved it. The entire catastrophe that unmade civilization was a proof that human beings, given sufficiently powerful tools, will use those tools to destroy themselves and each other. Therefore, the most important task of any surviving organized group is to control the technology, to gather it, to study it carefully, to ensure that it never again finds its way into hands that aren't trained and disciplined enough to handle it responsibly. It's a position that makes a certain kind of sense if you've just watched your world end because of what unchecked technology produced. It's also a position that, taken to its logical conclusion, becomes something deeply problematic. The Brotherhood doesn't share technology. They gather it, catalog it, and keep it. The communities that might benefit from a working medical scanner, or a functional water purifier, or a piece of pre-war agricultural technology don't get access, because the Brotherhood has decided that access to technology is a privilege to be managed, not a resource to be distributed. Their position as guardians is not philanthropic, it's proprietary. They've appointed themselves the curators of human civilization's toolkit, and they're not running a lending library. Different chapters of the Brotherhood have taken this ideology to different places. The original chapter in California became more isolationist over time, retreating into their bunkers, becoming less interested in the world outside, and more focused on their internal hierarchy and traditions. The Capital Wasteland chapter, introduced in Fallout 3 under Elder Lyons, had been sent east to recover technology and got sidetracked by the actual suffering of actual people. Lyons decided that helping the wasteland was more important than the technology mission, a heresy that earned him censure from the Western chapters and the love of the people he was helping. Elder Maxson, the Younger, in Fallout 4, represents a brotherhood that has swung back hard toward its original mandate. His chapter uses Prydwen, a massive airship, as a mobile base of operations and sweeps through the Commonwealth, claiming technology and destroying perceived threats with overwhelming force. His definition of threat includes synths, because synths are technology and technology in the wrong hands is dangerous, and the fact that some synths have developed what functions as consciousness doesn't change the calculus for him. When Maxson discovers that Paladin Dance, his most decorated officer, a man he respects, is a synth, the response is instructive. Dance must die. Not because he has done anything differently than he would have done if he were human. Not because his judgment is compromised, or his loyalty questionable, because he is a thing and things are controlled, not left to operate independently. The tragedy of Dance is that he agrees with this assessment. His entire identity has been built around brotherhood ideology, and when that ideology turns on him, he doesn't have the framework to resist it. He's been trained to defer to the organization's judgment in all things. He defers even when the organization's judgment is that he doesn't deserve to exist. You can save Dance with the right choices, the right dialogue, the right faction alignments, but you can't save him from what he now knows about himself, and that knowledge doesn't get any lighter. The Brotherhood's relationship with the followers of the Apocalypse, the other major organization dedicated to technology in the Fallout universe, is perhaps the clearest illustration of the ideological gap between hoarding and sharing. The followers are academics, medics, historians. They go into the wasteland with medical supplies and books and try to help people. They train local healers, distribute what knowledge they have, and believe that the most effective use of pre-war knowledge is getting it into as many hands as possible, as quickly as possible. The Brotherhood considers this irresponsible. The followers consider the Brotherhood's approach a form of aristocracy, a self-appointed elite deciding that regular people can't be trusted with knowledge that might save their lives. Neither is entirely right. The followers have occasionally been responsible for distributing knowledge that's been weaponized against the communities they were trying to help. The Brotherhood has occasionally prevented catastrophic misuse of technology that would have killed large numbers of people. The debate between them is, at its core, a very old human argument about who gets to make decisions for everyone else and under what authority. The Brotherhood's history is also entangled with something the game refers to as the Maxon bloodline. The founding Maxon's descendants have occupied leadership positions within the Brotherhood across multiple games. Elder Lyons in Fallout 3 has a daughter, Sarah, who is a soldier. Arthur Maxon in Fallout 4 is described as a descendant of Roger Maxon. The Brotherhood's founding mythology is inseparable from the family that founded it, which gives the organization a quasi-dynastic quality that sits uncomfortably alongside its military structures. There are also the remnants of the Brotherhood that never made it back from whatever mission they were on, scattered across the wasteland in small groups, disconnected from the main chapters, holding on to the ideology without the institutional support. Some of them have become genuinely good people, trying to do something useful with the training and the armor and the conviction they were given. Some of them have become isolated and strange, the ideology calcified into something rigid and difficult to reason with. The question the Brotherhood asks about every piece of technology who should control this, and under what terms, is actually an important question. It's just that the Brotherhood's answer is always the same, and the same answer applied to every situation is not reasoning, it's reflex. The wasteland is complicated enough that reflex is insufficient. Even well-armed reflex in power armor, backed up by laser rifles and a flying warship. The second Battle of Hoover Dam is the climax of Fallout New Vegas, and every faction that's been building toward it believes, genuinely, that their victory is what's best for the Mojave Wasteland and for humanity more broadly. None of them are entirely wrong. None of them are entirely right. The game is too honest to pretend otherwise. The New California Republic is the closest the post-war West has come to rebuilding something recognizable as a modern democratic government. Multiple states, an elected president, a constitution recently amended, courts and laws and a professional military, trade routes and economic policy, and all the administrative apparatus that civilization requires. The NCR is, in many respects, the best option on offer in the Mojave. It's also stretched grotesquely thin, suffering from the same bureaucratic corruption and institutional inertia and overextension of resources that brought down the pre-war United States. The soldiers at the front lines of the NCR's Mojave operations are underpaid, under-equipped, and commanded by officers who are more concerned with career advancement than with tactical effectiveness. Camp Forlorn Hope is a humanitarian disaster. Camp McCarran is a nest of intelligence service rivalry and incompetent leadership. The NCR wants Hoover Dam because the power it could generate would solve many of the Republic's energy problems, but the dam has become a symbol rather than a strategic reality. The NCR's senators and bureaucrats are far away from the Mojave. The people dying in the desert are following orders shaped by people who've never seen a Legion crucifixion up close. That gap between policy and consequence is one of the NCR's fundamental problems, and the Fallout universe treats it with the seriousness it deserves. Caesar's Legion is the Apocalypse's attempt at Rome. Edward Sallow, who named himself Caesar, was a follower of the apocalypse who went east with another follower named Joshua Graham to study tribal languages in the Grand Canyon. What he found there was a collection of fragmented, disorganized tribes who were being destroyed by larger, more unified groups. He organized them. Using his followers' education history, Latin, Roman military structure, he built a faction that could compete. The ideology that resulted is brutal and coherent, and based on a reading of history that is, in certain limited respects, accurate. Caesar argues that the democratic republic model failed. The pre-war United States was a democracy, and it ended the world. The NCR is rebuilding a democracy and is reproducing the same inefficiencies and corruptions that the original failed. What the wasteland needs is strength and discipline and unity, and the Legion provides those things. What Caesar doesn't address, or addresses inadequately, is that the strength and discipline of the Legion is purchased at an extraordinary price in human suffering. The Legion's treatment of conquered peoples, particularly women, is among the darkest institutionalized cruelty in the Fallout universe. Slavery is central to how the Legion operates. Brutal punishment for any deviation from Legion law is not incidental but architectural. The order Caesar has built is real, but it is the order of enforced terror, and the peace it produces is the peace of people too exhausted and afraid to resist. Caesar's brain tumor is one of the most quietly significant details in New Vegas. The man who has shaped the destiny of the Southwest through sheer force of personality and intellectual conviction is dying, and the institution he built is not designed to survive him. The Legion is Caesar. Without him, its internal power struggles already visible if you pay attention to the dynamics at the fort will almost certainly produce fragmentation. The very strength that makes the Legion effective depends on the continued existence of one specific person, which is not a sustainable model for civilization. Robert House, watching all of this from the Lucky 38's penthouse, would say that's exactly his point. Democratic republics corrode from within. Military dictatorships collapse when the dictator does. What the wasteland needs is a different model entirely. What House proposes is technocratic autocracy with long-term planning horizons. He has lived long enough to think in centuries rather than election cycles. He's not subject to the pressures of popularity or succession. He's not going to compromise his vision for short-term political gain, because there are no short-term political gains to be had, only the long-term project, which is the survival and eventual flourishing of human civilization under competent management. What he's missing, or what he's chosen to subordinate, is the question of what civilization is for. A civilization optimized purely for stability and technological advancement, governed by a single intelligence that has decided it knows best, is not necessarily a civilization that its inhabitants would choose to live in if they had the option. House's New Vegas is comfortable and functional. It's also a place where the Strip's most powerful residents are managed like livestock, like the White Glove Society, encouraged to maintain their elegant facade, while their darker history is known and tolerated because they're useful. House keeps the factions in line by making them dependent on him and making the cost of deviation obvious. That's not tyranny in the crude sense. It's management. Sophisticated, benevolent-seeming, long-horizon management by someone who has genuinely thought about the problem more than anyone else around him. But management is not the same as governance. Governance requires the consent of the governed, at least in principle. House's system doesn't require consent, it requires compliance, which is a different thing. The yes man ending, where the courier takes independent control of New Vegas and runs it however they see fit, is the most interesting because it's the one that says the least. It ends with a question mark. The implication is that the courier player character, blank slate, the person who survived being shot in the head twice and reshaped the Mojave through their choices, might do better, or might do worse, or might do something entirely different, and the game can't tell you because you're the one who has to decide. That trust in the player, extended in the form of an open-ended ending, is one of Fallout New Vegas's greatest achievements. It's saying, we've shown you the options and their consequences, and we're not going to tell you which one is right, because this isn't that kind of story. The Divide, Ulysses, and the Courier's history we discussed in Section 7 are part of this broader question about what choices mean when they're made in ignorance. The Courier carried a package that destroyed a settlement without knowing what the package contained. The consequences were real and terrible. The intent was innocent. The wasteland doesn't run on intent, it runs on consequences. That's the hardest lesson the Mojave teaches. Not that evil exists, because evil existing is obvious. Not that power corrupts, because that's a lesson that predates the Fallout universe by millennia. The hardest lesson is that well-intentioned action without sufficient understanding produces harm that's indistinguishable from intentional harm to the people who experience it. The package the courier delivered activated the missiles in the Divide. The settlement burned. Ulysses lost everything. That the courier didn't know doesn't change what happened to the people of the Divide. They are equally dead. The wasteland requires understanding before action, and it rarely gives you enough time to acquire the understanding you need before requiring the action. The oldest ghoul in the Fallout universe is probably several hundred years old. Ghouls, humans who've been so thoroughly irradiated that their biology has been forced into a kind of suspended cellular state, don't age in the normal way. Their skin deteriorates, their appearance over decades and then centuries becomes increasingly difficult to look at without clinical detachment. But they continue. They persist. Some of them, the ones who've kept their minds through the transformation and the years, are living encyclopedias of things that happened before anyone now alive was born. Harold is one of the oldest, a friendly, unusual figure who appeared in the original Fallout games, a ghoul with a tree growing out of his head, named Bob, who, over the centuries, has spread through Harold's body until Harold himself is rooted in place. By Fallout 3, Harold is at the center of a grove in the oasis, and the tree that grew from him has spread seeds across the area, producing the only genuine green in the capital wasteland. He's been growing for so long that he doesn't fully remember where he began. He knows it hurt, he knows it was strange. He can't always find the edges of where Harold ends and Bob begins. He wants to die. The members of the Oasis commune who've discovered him have split into factions over this. Some want to keep him alive because of what his growth is doing for the land. Some want to contain it. Some want to let him finally have what he's been asking for. The lone wanderer gets to decide. The ghoul situation in the Fallout universe is entangled with discrimination in ways that reward extended attention. Ghouls are human beings who underwent a transformation they didn't choose. They look frightening by human standards. The radiation has done things to their bodies that make immediate visual recognition difficult. They have the same range of personalities, the same emotional lives, the same moral complexity as any human population. They also live, potentially, indefinitely, which means the oldest of them have been alive long enough that the concept of a normal human lifespan has become genuinely abstract to them, and they're frequently treated as subhuman, systematically excluded from settlements. Shot on sight in enough locations that ghoul travelers have developed routes through the wasteland that avoid the places where that's most likely to happen. The Brotherhood of Steel again has a policy of categorizing ghouls alongside supermutants as creatures to be neutralized rather than people to be engaged with. The irony, which Fallout always enjoys surfacing, is that the people doing the discriminating are the descendants of people who came out of the vaults, who had the privilege of shelter during the apocalypse that produced the ghouls. The ghouls were outside. The ghouls paid for survival with their appearance. And now the people who were safe underground have appointed themselves the judges of who deserves to be treated as a person. Cooper Howard the Ghoul in the Amazon Prime series is a particularly powerful example of this dynamic because he was alive before the bombs. He knows what the world was like. He knows what the pre-war society was like from the inside. He was the face of Vault-Tec's promotional campaigns, the man who sold the vaults to the American public with a cowboy's charm and a movie star's smile. He believed in what he was doing, at least initially, and then he learned what he was doing it for. 200 years later, he is something that most people in the wasteland would shoot before speaking to. His body has been chemically preserved by whatever the ghoulification process did to him, and he's wandered through 2 centuries of a world he remembers the before of in ways nobody around him can. He's watched things be built and destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. He's seen ideologies rise and collapse. He's carried the knowledge of what caused all of it, and nobody wants to hear it from something that looks like him. The feral ghoul is the shadow of all of this. Not all ghouls maintain their cognitive function through the long haul of their extended lives. Some lose it. The reasons aren't entirely understood: radiation levels, individual variation, psychological trauma, some combination of all 3. But the result is a ghoul who retains the physical resilience but loses the mind. Feral ghouls are in some sense more pitiable than threatening because they were once people, and the person is still in there somewhere, just completely beyond reach. Fallout 4 introduces a mechanic and a corresponding debate among researchers in the game world about whether feral ghouls can be brought back. whether the cognitive loss is truly irreversible, whether the right treatment, the right approach, could reach the person buried beneath the feral behavior. Most characters dismiss this as wishful thinking. A small number of researchers disagree. The question matters because feral ghouls are killed casually throughout every Fallout game. They're enemies, they attack, you defeat them. The lore complicates that clean transaction by suggesting that each one was someone, that the Dunwich Building's feral ghouls, wandering through the ruins of that particular horror, might be the remnants of people who worked there, who had families and lunch breaks, and probably didn't know what was at the bottom of the quarry when they signed their employment contracts. The ghoul who was a Vault-Tec representative, the ghoul who was a nuclear submarine officer, Harold with his tree, Cooper Howard who sold the vaults and outlived everything, Raul Tejada, the ghoul mechanic companion in New Vegas who was born in Mexico City in the early 21st century and has been watching the world die and try to come back for 200 years and has a very dry sense of humor about all of it. These are not a category of creature. They're people who got unlucky, or unlucky in an unusual way, and have been paying for that particular variety of bad luck ever since. The Fallout universe covers an enormous geographical area, and the games have only ever illuminated corners of it. California, Nevada, Washington, D.C., Boston, West Virginia, the Texas and Florida panhandles, glimpsed but not explored. The Midwest, touched briefly in Fallout Tactics but not developed in the main series. The Pacific Northwest, the entire eastern seaboard north of D.C., the southern states, the interior of the continent. All of this exists in the Fallout universe but has only ever been discussed in fragments in passing comments by characters, in terminal entries that mention places beyond the playable area, in lore books and radio broadcasts that gesture toward a larger world without quite letting you into it. The fan community has spent decades trying to piece together what the rest of the world looks like. Some of what's implied is fascinating. The Gulf Coast region, around what was New Orleans, apparently has its own distinctive post-war culture. The super mutants, who ended up in the East, are different from the California variants in ways that suggest the FEV strains scattered differently across the country. The Great Plains, largely emptied of organized factions, may be the wasteland's version of wilderness, now enormous, irradiated spaces where the absence of any controlling power has allowed something like natural selection to run unchecked on the surviving animal and plant life. China. This one is discussed almost never, in part because the Fallout universe has always been resolutely American in its geography, and in part because what can be implied about post-war China is so bleak that it functions as a kind of contextual horror around the edges of the story. The resource wars that preceded the Great War included the United States occupation of Alaska, a massive military operation that displaced and killed Chinese civilians and soldiers. The bioweapon experiments the U.S. conducted may have been tested on Chinese populations. And then the bombs fell, and China received the same nuclear response the U.S. did, and whatever civilization had existed there was presumably as thoroughly destroyed as anything in North America. Captain Zhao on his submarine is the closest the franchise comes to engaging with this directly. He spent 200 years in Boston Harbor, waiting for orders that were never going to come, from a command structure that no longer existed, his crew dead around him, his mission long since irrelevant. When you encounter him, his conflict isn't whether to fight or run. It's what to do with the rest of an existence he didn't plan for. He fired his missiles. He did what he was ordered to do. The world ended. He survived. And now what? The answer the game offers is quiet and compassionate. Help him. Get him fuel. Let him leave. The Yangtze sails away from Boston Harbor and the game doesn't tell you where it goes. Maybe back toward what used to be China. Maybe somewhere else. Somewhere Zhao can figure out what the next chapter of an impossibly long life looks like. Europe is another mystery. Pre-war Fallout lore includes the European Commonwealth, which fought its own resource wars in the Middle East and eventually collapsed in the process. What happened to Europe after the Great War, whether it received nuclear strikes, whether its own internal conflicts had already destroyed it, whether any of it survived in recognizable form, is not established in the main games. Fan projects like Fallout London have imagined versions of a post-war Britain, and the recently released Fallout London mod presents a city that managed a form of survival through different systems than the American wasteland. But the official lore has nothing to say. Europe is an absence. The rest of the world is an absence. The Fallout universe is simultaneously global. The Great War was a global event. The resource wars touched every continent. The trade networks that collapsed were international and parochial because the games can only tell you about the places the games take you. This creates a specific kind of atmospheric mystery. The wasteland you walk through is connected to things you can't see. The ships that stopped coming, the radio signals from other continents that went silent, the satellites still orbiting, their cameras still recording, their transmissions going nowhere. The world outside North America is still out there, somewhere, in whatever condition 200 years of aftermath has produced. Nobody in the wasteland knows. They don't have the resources or the reach to find out. The world they live in has contracted to the distance they can walk and the signals they can receive. And anything beyond that is as theoretical as the pre-war world their grandparents' described in stories. There's something deeply melancholy in that. The pre-war world was connected, instantaneously, globally, irrevocably connected in ways that no previous civilization had managed. The Great War severed all of those connections simultaneously, and 200 years later, the severance is so complete that most people in the wasteland don't think about what lies on the other side of the ocean because they have no way to cross it and no reliable information about what's there. The world got very small when it ended. That contraction is part of why the Mojave's relative stability under House, or the NCR's attempts to rebuild something connected and organized, feel significant. Not because either of those systems is ideal, but because the project of reconnection, of rebuilding the web of interaction and mutual dependence that makes civilization possible, is genuinely important and genuinely difficult, and the people trying to do it are doing it without the infrastructure that once made it possible. There is a recurring figure in the Fallout universe who appears without warning, helps decisively, and vanishes before you can ask who he is. The mysterious stranger, a man in a fedora and a long coat, appearing from nowhere in moments of crisis, firing a single shot that changes everything, and then gone. He's been in every Fallout game in some form. He appears during VAT sequences in some titles. The camera cuts away, the shot connects, and when it returns to your character, the stranger is nowhere to be seen. He appears in random encounters in others, a figure standing in the wasteland who reacts to your presence but says very little, and who disappears when you look away. Nick Valentine's obsession with identifying him is one of Fallout 4's most compelling companion subplots. Nick is a detective by training and temperament. The mysterious stranger is the one case he can't crack. He collects information, notices patterns, develops theories, and comes no closer to an answer than anyone else. The stranger doesn't want to be found, or he doesn't exist in the way that findable things exist, or the question of his nature is the wrong question. There's a detail that players have noted repeatedly, the magnum that plays the stranger's theme music when drawn. It can be acquired in New Vegas from an arms dealer. When you hold it, the same guitar sting plays. This means either the stranger himself sold it at some point, or the gun has properties that aren't dependent on the stranger holding it, or the connection between the weapon and the figure who carries it is more metaphysical than physical. One reading of the mysterious stranger, not supported by any official lore, but consistent with the evidence, is that he's a projection. A thing the wasteland produces when someone needs intervention badly enough, the universe's own error correction mechanism expressing itself as a man with a gun and a hat. This reading makes him feel like folklore that turned real, which is not an unusual thing in the Fallout universe. Another reading is more grounded. He's a ghoul of extraordinary age who has spent centuries helping people, who has decided that this is what his extended existence is for, and who has been careful enough about concealing his identity that no one has ever pinned down what he actually is. In this reading, the mysterious stranger is the positive counterpart to the damaged and wandering ghouls who've lost their direction over the years. He found a direction. He's kept it. A third reading, darker. He's Vault-Tec, a late-stage experiment in long-duration observation. Someone sent into the wasteland with enhanced capabilities and an indefinite lifespan to monitor the recovery of human civilization from the outside, appearing occasionally in ways that influence outcomes, generating data about what kinds of intervention produce what kinds of long-term results. None of these are provable. All of them are the kind of theory that fits the Fallout universe's willingness to embed genuinely strange things into its corners and leave them without explanation. Misfortune is the mysterious stranger's female equivalent, appearing in some games to curse enemies rather than shoot them, a figure in dark clothing who arrives, disrupts, and disappears. Whether she's connected to the stranger or a separate phenomenon operating on similar principles is not established. Whether she's his equal or his opposite or his partner or simply a parallel development is left to interpretation. The lone wanderer, in one of the Capital Wasteland's stranger recurring encounters, can meet a figure called the Wanderer in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, a ghoul who says cryptic things and implies a history that stretches back further than seems possible. The connection, if any, to other mysterious figures is not confirmed. The Wasteland generates its own mythology. Given enough time and enough people trying to make sense of things that don't have obvious explanations, folk narratives develop around the gaps. The mysterious stranger is both a gameplay mechanic and a piece of that folk mythology, something that happens to people in the Wasteland and gets told in versions that diverge from each other, because no two people who've encountered him agree on exactly what they saw. That's appropriate for something that might be a person, might be a projection, might be an intervention from somewhere outside the ordinary logic of the world. The Wasteland has produced things that don't fit any category the pre-war world science was equipped to handle. The Dunwich obelisk is one example. The Mothman is another. The mysterious stranger might be a third, something that looks like a man but operates according to principles that aren't quite human ones. Or he's a guy who's very good at his job and very committed to his privacy. The Wasteland doesn't insist on an answer. It just shows you the hat retreating around the corner and leaves you standing there with the echo of a guitar string in the air. The mythology of the Fallout universe tends to focus on the apocalypse and its aftermath. But the pre-war world, the world the bombs destroyed, was its own kind of dark, and understanding it changes how the Wasteland reads. The resource wars began in 2052. The United Nations, which had been operating since the end of the Second World War as a forum for international conflict resolution, collapsed due to the cascading pressures of resource scarcity and economic instability that followed the end of cheap oil. Without the UN, international disputes had no neutral arbiter. With no neutral arbiter, disputes became conflicts. With conflicts escalating, nuclear threats returned to the foreground of international politics for the first time since the Cold War. The European Commonwealth's military intervention in the Middle East over oil fields produced a war that ground on for years. The United States, simultaneously fighting its own resource pressures, began looking at Alaska and the massive petroleum deposits beneath it as a strategic prize rather than simply another state. When China attempted to secure the same deposits through different means, the conflict became direct. The Anchorage Campaign, American troops in Alaska fighting Chinese forces in conditions that the conventional military history glosses over, but the Fallout universe's terminal entries describe with uncomfortable specificity. The atrocities on both sides. The use of biological and chemical weapons. The prison camps. The things that happened to civilians. While the war ran, the domestic situation in the United States was deteriorating in ways the government preferred not to acknowledge publicly. Chinese American citizens were being interned, a direct echo of the Japanese internment during the Second World War, with all the same rationalizations about security and all the same actual motivations of fear and racism. Civil liberties were being curtailed under emergency provisions. The press was being managed. The resource scarcity that was driving the international conflicts was also driving domestic poverty and instability in ways the cheerful Vault-Tec advertisements and Nuka-Cola commercials deliberately avoided addressing. The pre-war United States in the Fallout universe looks like the 50s from a design perspective. All that chrome and those rounded shapes and that particular register of optimistic advertising. But what was actually happening in the government and the corporations was the logic of the mid-21st century pushed to its extreme. The aesthetic stayed retro. The power dynamics metastasized. Vault-Tec was selling safety to a population that was genuinely afraid. The fear was real. The threat was real. The solution they were selling was not what it appeared to be. That combination, real fear, real vulnerability, a product that exploits both while delivering something other than promised, is not exotic. It is deeply recognizable. The people who lined up at Vault-Tec offices, who paid what they could for Vault residency, who took their children to the facilities with their few permitted possessions and walked through the heavy round doors, they were ordinary people doing the most sensible thing available to them in circumstances they hadn't created and couldn't control. They were not naive. They were not stupid. They were doing what people do when they're afraid, and the people selling safety are better funded than the people telling the truth. That's the mundane horror underneath the grand lore. Not Vault-Tec as a cartoon villain, but Vault-Tec as a recognizable institution, staffed by recognizable people, exploiting recognizable fears in ways that are common enough that we have regulatory frameworks in our world specifically designed to limit them. The frameworks didn't work in the Fallout universe, or they worked for a while, and then were captured by the institutions they were supposed to regulate, and then they stopped working. The nuclear fire that followed was not a bolt from the blue. It was the end of a process that had been building for decades, visible in the data if you knew how to read it, legible in the patterns of institutional behavior if you knew what to look for. Richard Gray knew what to look for. Before he became the master, before he fell into the FEV vats and became something else, he was a researcher trying to understand the shape of the disaster. He went into the wasteland looking for answers. He found the vats instead, and the answers he arrived at after his transformation were shaped by what the virus did to his ability to feel other people's pain, which was to make him feel it all the time, constantly, every damaged human being in his vicinity, registering as a wound he could sense but couldn't ignore. The Master's Unity Project was a trauma response, the conclusion of a man who had been broken open to the suffering of the world and decided that the only solution was to change the world so thoroughly that the suffering became structurally impossible. Not therapy, not slow reform, total transformation of the human species at the genetic level. He was catastrophically wrong about the method. But the suffering he was responding to was real. The wasteland is full of that real suffering. That's what makes it habitable as a fictional space, not the monsters and the ruins and the dark lore, but the people inside it who are trying, in the ways available to them, to make something better from what remains. The wasteland goes on. It has always gone on. 200 years, and it's still extending in every direction from wherever you're standing, still generating new stories and new questions and new ruins, with new terminal entries and new personal effects that belong to people who deserve to be more than footnotes. What we've covered tonight is a framework, not an exhaustive map. The Great War and the question of who fired first. The Vault experiments and what they were building toward. The FEV and the tragedy of the Master. The Dunwich building and whatever is waiting at the bottom of it. The Enclave and the artificial president who could be talked out of mass murder. The Brotherhood and its relationship with technology as property. New Vegas and its various competing visions of what civilization should look like. Appalachia's cryptids and cults, the Institute, and the question of consciousness. The small stories embedded in the rubble, the bigger picture the franchise has always been pointing toward. There are dozens more where those came from. Dozens of vaults we haven't visited. Dozens of named characters whose histories we didn't trace. The original Fallout's cathedral and the children of the cathedral, and the nature of the Master's psychic network. The She, the descendants of a crashed Chinese submarine in San Francisco, building a new culture from the fragments of one destroyed. The Hubologists and their pre-war science cult. The great cons and the long, sad history of their repeated destruction and reconstitution. Arcade Gannon and his Enclave family history. The honest hearts of Zion, and what Joshua Graham built there after surviving something that should have been unsurvivable. The franchise is 28 years old as of the original release of the first game. In that time, the writers and designers who have contributed to it have built something that rewards almost any amount of attention you're willing to give it. The lore is deep because multiple generations of creative people have cared about making it deep, about ensuring that every terminal entry and every audio log and every piece of environmental storytelling adds something real rather than just filling space. The satire underneath it has remained relevant not because the franchise is prescient in any magical sense, but because the problems it's satirizing are structural. Corporations that prioritize their own survival over the survival of the people they claim to serve. Governments captured by the institutions they were supposed to regulate. Military technology developed without ethical constraint. The concentration of power in the hands of people who believe their superior access to resources and information qualifies them to make decisions for everyone else. The tendency of institutions, when frightened, to become exactly what they claim to be protecting against. These are not new problems. They are not problems that the Fallout universe invented. They're problems that human civilization has been generating and failing to solve for as long as human civilization has existed. The retro-futuristic aesthetic, the nuclear apocalypse, the super mutants and power armor, and bottle caps as currency, all of this is a costume on concerns that would be recognizable without it. That's why the franchise endures. That's why, after 28 years, new people keep finding their way to it and finding something that resonates. The wasteland is strange and specific and its own thing. And it's also a mirror with excellent lighting, pointed in a direction that's hard to look away from. The vaults are sealed. The experiments continue. The obelisk waits in the dark at the bottom of the Dunwich building, whatever name it calls itself by. And somewhere out there, past the edge of the playable map, the world extends in every direction, and the morning is coming, slowly, the way mornings always come whether you're ready for it or not. War never changes. But sometimes in the space between one catastrophe and the next, the people trying to make something good out of the aftermath manage it. Not always. Not without cost. Not in ways that look clean from the outside or feel simple from the inside. But they manage it. That's the thing about the Fallout universe, that the darkness can make it easy to miss. It's not purely a tragedy. It's a tragedy that keeps producing people who refuse to accept that tragedy is all there is. The followers of the apocalypse still going out into the wasteland with medical supplies and textbooks. The Minutemen rebuilding one settlement at a time. Curie discovering what it means to be alive and finding it extraordinary. Dogmeat following you through hell with uncomplicated loyalty. Marcus running Jacobstown, an old soldier who outlived his war and found something else to do. The dark is real. It's deep and it's well built, and it has been thought about carefully by people who understood what they were doing. But it's not the only thing in there. That's what lets you close your eyes in the wasteland and still be all right. Sleep well. The Pip-Boy light fades. The world goes quiet. War never changes. But people sometimes do. If this found you somewhere comfortable, if the wasteland made for reasonable company tonight, consider leaving a like and dropping a comment below with where you are and what time it is for you. There's something I find genuinely lovely about the idea of people in different time zones and different places all finding their way to the same dark corner of this fictional world at the same time. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the moment. More of this is coming, more late nights, more lore, more quiet hours in the ruins of things that deserve more attention than they usually get. Thank you for being here, genuinely. Now get some sleep. Let's go back to the Divide, because it deserves more than the summary treatment. The Lonesome Road is the final DLC for Fallout New Vegas, and it is the most personal of the game's expanded content. It takes the question the main game refuses to fully address: who is the courier, and what have they done, and uses it to build something genuinely affecting. Not easy, not comforting, affecting in the way that good fiction about difficult things can be affecting, which is to say it makes you feel things you didn't know you had room for. The Divide is what's left of a place that used to be something. A developing community in the borderlands east of the Mojave, growing in the years before the main game's events. It was the kind of thing the wasteland doesn't produce, often a genuine, unaffiliated settlement with enough stability and enough people that it might have eventually become a city. Might have become, over time, a node in the recovering network of human civilization. It destroyed itself before that could happen. The courier was there. The courier carried something, a package, one of several deliveries they were running at the time. This particular package, when it arrived at its destination in the Divide, activated a network of buried ICBM warheads that the previous military infrastructure had left in the area. The entire region was devastated by the resulting explosions and earthquakes. The Divide became exactly what it sounds like, a scarred trench of ruined landscape where constant windstorms carry irradiated debris through canyons of broken concrete and bent steel. Ulysses was there. He'd been building something in the Divide. A home, maybe? A community, maybe? Something he'd invested enough of himself in that the loss of it is still, years later, the primary fact of his existence. He watched it burn. He knew the courier had carried the package. He spent the years since then building toward this confrontation, the conversation at the end of the Divide, where he explains what happened and demands an accounting. What makes Lonesome Road extraordinary is that the courier cannot say they didn't do it. They can't claim innocence of the outcome. The package was in their hands. The path they walked took them through the Divide. The timing was theirs. They had no way of knowing what the package contained, and the game is clear about this. There's no indication that the courier knew, no evidence that they intended anything other than a standard delivery. But intent doesn't reconstruct the Divide. Ignorance doesn't bring back the people who died there. Ulysses's position is that the courier should at minimum understand what they did, should not walk through a world shaped by their actions without knowing how that shaping happened. He's not purely wrong about this. The demand to understand the consequences of your actions, even the unintended ones, is not an unreasonable demand. The question of what to do with that understanding, whether guilt is appropriate for unintended consequences, whether there's a meaningful moral distinction between "I didn't know" and "I should have known," is the conversation the DLC is really having. You can talk Ulysses out of his planned nuclear strikes. You can show him that destroying the NCR and the Legion staging grounds he's targeting won't actually produce the clean aftermath he's envisioned, that the wasteland will just fill the power vacuum with something else, and the courier's people and the communities they're connected to will pay for it. He's not immune to this argument. He's been thinking about these things for a long time, and he's honest enough that when a coherent counter-argument is presented, he engages with it. Or, you can fight him. The game allows that. The conversation, as so many conversations in the Fallout universe do, ends either in words or in violence. And both are valid expressions of how that particular encounter might go. What stays is the image of the divide. What the community might have become. The people whose names appear on the abandoned infrastructure, in the audio logs that still play in areas where the power somehow still works, the wind that moves through the canyons carrying dust that used to be something else. The courier standing at the end of a road they walked without understanding where it led. That image is one of the more honest things the franchise has produced about what it means to move through a world you're shaping without knowing how. The Fallout universe is full of decisions. It's built on decisions. But Lonesome Road asks what it means to be responsible for a decision you didn't make consciously, and it doesn't let you escape the question. The nuclear flags you can launch from the divide at the end of the DLC, nuking the NCR's main staging area, the Legion's main staging area, both. Neither are the final expression of this. You've walked the divide. You understand what happened there, as much as anyone can. And now you have the option to inflict that kind of devastation deliberately, with full knowledge of what you're doing, on populations that aren't your enemies so much as they're the current occupants of a conflict that predates them. Most players don't nuke anyone. But the option being there is part of the point. You have this power now. With this knowledge, what do you do with it? The courier, walking back out of the divide in whatever condition the final fight left them in, carries all of that. The package delivered years ago. The community that didn't make it. The man who built something in the ruins and lost it. The conversation that may or may not have resolved anything. The flags they may or may not have planted. The wasteland is waiting. The main story of New Vegas is still unfinished. Hoover Dam is still there. Whatever version of the Mojave's future the courier is going to help determine is still ahead of them. They pick themselves up and walk back west. Zion National Park survived the Great War largely intact. This is not a coincidence exactly. The park was remote enough, geographically distant enough from major population centers, and lacking in the industrial and military significance that made other areas primary targets. The bombs didn't specifically spare it. They just didn't specifically hit it. And the result, 2 centuries later, is the only location in any Fallout game that looks genuinely beautiful, green and red and alive, with running water and clean air and the kind of natural environment that the pre-war world took for granted and that the post-war world treats as something miraculous. The Honest Hearts DLC sends the courier into this surviving paradise, and it immediately complicates the paradise with the people who live in it and the violence that is coming for them. The Whitelegs are a tribe that has been hired or manipulated, or given reason to destroy the communities that have formed in Zion. Specifically, the Sorrows and the Dead Horses, 2 groups who have developed distinct cultures in the valley. The Dead Horses, in particular, have organized themselves around a remarkable figure, Joshua Graham. Graham was the Malpais legate of Caesar's Legion, the military commander who fought beside Caesar in the campaigns that built the Legion. He was the first legate, the man Caesar relied on for execution and strategy, and the particular combination of intelligence and brutality that the Legion's expansion required. And then came the first battle of Hoover Dam, and the Legion was defeated, and Caesar decided that the legate's failure required a demonstration that would make the punishment memorable. Caesar doused Joshua Graham in pitch and set him on fire. Then he had what remained thrown into the Grand Canyon. Graham survived. This is the detail that contains everything about him. He should not have survived. By any medical or physical assessment, a person set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon should not survive. But he did, and the survival radicalized him in a direction neither Caesar nor anyone else anticipated. He climbed out of the canyon. He healed. After a fashion. He found the Mormon missionaries who had been working in Zion, and he joined them, and he converted, and he made his way to the valley that eventually became his home and his project. When you meet him in Honest Hearts, he is leading the dead horses. He is the most effective warrior in Zion, and he is a man who has engaged at length and in depth with questions of violence and faith and the relationship between them. He wears his bandages always the burns from Caesar's fire, never fully healed, or at least he's chosen not to reveal what lies beneath them. He speaks with the careful precision of someone who thinks before every sentence and means every word. His theology is genuinely interesting and somewhat unusual for a video game character. He believes in mercy but doesn't believe it precludes violence. He believes that protecting the innocent sometimes requires doing things that are not pleasant, and he has made a kind of peace with that, not the comfortable peace of rationalization, but the harder peace of someone who has examined the contradiction for years and found that it can be sustained even if it can't be resolved. He has harmed people who deserved it and people who didn't, and he lives with both, and neither fact lets him off the hook for the other. The courier's central choice in Honest Hearts is whether to help Graham pursue the Whitelegs, aggressively driving them out of Zion with maximum force, potentially following their retreat far enough to effectively end their capacity to threaten the valley again, or to help Daniel, the pacifist missionary who wants to lead the Sorrows out of Zion entirely, abandoning it to the violence rather than answering violence with violence. Both choices have real costs. The pacifist option abandons Zion and the beautiful thing that's been built in it. The aggressive option means following Graham into something that costs everyone involved. There is no option that preserves everything worth preserving. The game respects its audience enough to mean it when it presents that situation. Graham's line, when the courier asks him whether it's possible to be too hard on themselves, is one of the franchise's better pieces of dialogue. He says he used to be consumed by pride, and now he just tries to do what he can with what time he has. The burn scars under the bandages are, in his theology, a mercy, a constant reminder of who he was, a physical tether to the specific gravity of his past choices that prevents him from floating above accountability. He didn't ask to be the person who survived. He became a better one, incrementally, because the survival left him no other option but to decide what to do with it. The Sierra Madre Casino. It's been trying to open since before the bombs fell. The grand opening was never completed, because the Great War arrived first, and in the 200 years since, the casino has been sealed inside a cloud of toxic chemical fog generated by the collar bomb dispensers the pre-war owner Sinclair installed throughout the villa that surrounds it. The fog kills. The holograms that staff the casino are still operating, still going through their pre-war routines in the empty spaces, still responding to intrusions with lethal force. And the vault at the center of the Sierra Madre contains more pre-war gold than anyone in the Mojave Wasteland can easily imagine. Dead Money is the DLC that the Fallout franchise used to tell its most sustained story about addiction and sunk cost. The courier is lured into the Sierra Madre's broadcast and rendered unconscious and awakened with a collar bomb around their neck. They find others in the same situation. Christine Royce, a Brotherhood scribe with her own complicated history. God, Dog, a super mutant with two distinct personalities arguing over control of the same body. Dean Domino, a pre-war lounge singer who has been in the villa for 2 centuries, sustained by the same fog that kills everything else, unable to leave and unable to stop trying to reach the vault. The design of the DLC is intentionally punishing. The fog damages your character constantly unless you're near air filtration vents. Items are scarce. The ghost people, former residents of the villa who've been trapped in their hazmat suits long enough that they've fused with them, becoming something inhuman, are resilient and persistent. Every resource requires careful management. The Sierra Madre teaches you scarcity in a game that typically rewards accumulation. The thematic heart of it is in the terminals scattered through the villa, where you reconstruct the relationship between Frederick Sinclair, the casino's owner, and Vera Keyes, the actress who was his planned headliner and who he loved, perhaps more than was good for either of them. Sinclair was building the Sierra Madre as a gift, as a monument to something he felt for her that he didn't know how to express any other way than through spectacle. The vault with the gold, the system of collars to manage the staff, the entire elaborate infrastructure of the place, it was all meant to be a new start. For both of them. What actually happened is more complicated. Vera was involved with Dean Domino. Domino was using her to get information about the casino's security. And Vera, caught between loyalty to Domino and something genuine that had developed with Sinclair, ended up leaving a message in the casino's systems that inadvertently became the trigger for its lockdown. A recording of her voice was built into the casino's security as a backup, a woman saying she was trapped, because Sinclair thought that even if everything went wrong, the sound of her voice could reach someone who would help. It reached no one. The bombs fell. The lockdown activated. The fog began. And Vera's voice has been playing on repeat for 200 years, a distress call with no one to hear it, in a place that nothing can leave. Dean Domino has been in there the whole time. He can't leave because of the fog. He can't die normally because of the same process that sustains him. He has been living with what he did and what he failed to do and what he couldn't change for 2 centuries, in a ghost town staffed by holograms and haunted by a woman's recorded voice. Whatever he started as the lounge singer, the ambitious man who was using Vera to reach the gold, he is something different now. He has had 200 years to become different. Whether that's better or worse depends on which direction you're measuring from. The vault at the center of all of this contains the gold, as promised. When you reach it, you have the option of taking it. The game lets you try to take all of it. And then, with careful mechanic design, it makes you feel exactly what carrying too much of something you can't actually use feels like. The weight becomes literal, your movement slows, the things you might need in the immediate moment become inaccessible because you're full of something valuable, but not useful. You can leave it all behind. You can take some. The game points out, in its quietly sardonic way, that the gold bars don't do much in the actual Mojave wasteland economy. They're too heavy to carry, many of them. And the cap economy that functions in the wasteland doesn't have a great exchange mechanism for pre-war currency in bullion form. The Sierra Madre wanted to open. The Sierra Madre is still trying to open. Its holograms are still at their stations. Vera's voice is still broadcasting. The treasure at the center of it is still real. Some things hold on to their purpose even when the context that made that purpose meaningful has completely dissolved. The Sierra Madre is still a casino in the same way that a skeleton is still a person in terms of what it was, in terms of the architecture of what it's organized around, in terms of the shape of the intentions that built it. But the party never happened. The guests never came. The grand opening stayed pending. That's Dead Money's metaphor, delivered with no apology and considerable craft. Big Mountain Research and Development Center is the place where the pre-war military-industrial complex's appetite for research finally ate its own tail. The DLC Old World Blues functions differently from the others in the New Vegas package. It's genuinely funny, absurdist, satirical, committed to a register of dark comedy that makes the horror feel more manageable rather than less real. The think tank scientists who inhabit the facility and serve as your primary companions and antagonists are missing crucial parts of themselves. Their brains, their spinal cords, their hearts. These organs are in jars. The scientists continue to function extremely well in terms of raw cognitive output because the facility's technology keeps them operational. They've been operating without bodies for so long that they've lost the ability to relate to having had bodies. The most human thing about Dr. Zero is his obsession with kitchen appliances. The most human thing about Dr. Mobius, the ostensible villain of the DLC, is that he's the one scientist who retained enough moral perspective to recognize what the facility was doing and tried, however ineffectually, to keep it from spreading. He made himself appear as a threat to keep the other scientists occupied with local concerns, rather than unleashing their work on the wider wasteland. The experiments at Big MT are wild, in both senses of the word. Force fields powered by housewives, robotic dogs with missiles, biological anomalies scattered across the test zones in configurations that suggest the researchers were generating ideas faster than they could evaluate them. The Sync, the automated personal assistant system in your base of operations, contains AI companions who have developed distinct and fully realized personalities through decades of operation. The companion AIs in the Sync are, arguably, the most conscious characters in the DLC. The toaster wants to burn things with unexamined enthusiasm. The book chute is obsessive about proper document disposal, in ways that suggest it has developed a value system entirely around its function. The best friend AI speaks with warmth and genuine interest. These systems weren't designed to be people. They became something that functions as people through the accumulated weight of doing people things for a very long time. Old World Blues is partly about what happens when you remove the constraints that make human beings human. The hunger, the pain, the mortality, the emotional needs that create vulnerability and also connection. The scientists of Big MT had all of those constraints removed. What remained was intelligence and curiosity, and the drive to understand and manipulate and experiment, completely uncoupled from any mechanism that might make them feel the consequences of their work. The result is a facility full of extraordinary achievement and complete moral vacancy. The things they made are wonders, genuinely. The damage those wonders did to the world is in direct proportion to how extraordinary the wonders were. The courier, wandering through old-world blues with a brain and a jar for a head because the think tank extracted it for research purposes and forgot to put it back, is an accidental product of this facility's tendency to begin things without finishing them. There's a conversation you can have with your own brain, in the sink, after you recover it. Your brain has had time to think, in the tank, without the noise of a body and its demands and its distractions. It has developed opinions about the decisions you've been making. It's not entirely flattering. The dialogue is funny and also slightly disturbing in the way that the best self-reflection tends to be. Old World Blues is the Fallout franchise at its most willing to be silly about things that are genuinely terrible, and it works because the silliness is itself a kind of argument. The think tank scientists are funny because they're so completely disconnected from consequence. They're also, in that disconnection, an image of something the franchise has been criticizing throughout the academic and corporate and governmental compartmentalization that allows people to do terrible things by never having to see them as terrible. The scientists of Big MT didn't think of themselves as doing harm, they thought of themselves as doing science. The distinction to them was complete. The harm was a downstream effect that happened outside their visibility and therefore outside their responsibility. The consequences of their work are scattered across the Mojave wasteland. The Y-17 trauma harness, a powered exoskeleton designed to allow injured soldiers to continued functioning long after the soldiers inside died, the harnesses wandering the wasteland on automated routines, the skeletons of their former occupants rattling inside them. They're one of the more visceral images in the franchise. The technology doing exactly what it was designed to do. The human component reduced to an afterthought in its own design. There's something that happens when you spend a long time with any Fallout game that doesn't quite happen with other open-world games. The world rewards slowness. It rewards the decision to stop running toward the objective and sit with a location for a while, to read all the terminal entries rather than just the ones that unlock the next door, to listen to the audio logs in sequence rather than cherry-picking the one that gives you the map marker, to stand in the middle of a ruined kitchen and look at the table and the stopped clock on the wall and the single plate still sitting where someone left it when they heard the sirens. The games are built for this kind of attention. The environmental storytelling is dense enough that locations reward multiple passes, and the density isn't random, it's constructed by writers and designers who understood that the world they were building was going to be inhabited primarily through exploration rather than cutscene. The story in the ruins is the main story. The main story is supported by the ruins. This is part of why terminal entries and audio logs form such a significant part of the franchise's dark lore. They're not supplementary material. They're the primary mechanism by which the pre-war world is communicated to the player, because the pre-war world is gone and the only things it left behind are its records and its ruins. Reading those records in the ruins of the world they came from produces a specific kind of emotional effect that has no clean name. Something between grief and curiosity, something that knows the story is ending or has ended before you start reading, and reads anyway. Because what the people in the story did and felt and hoped and feared matters even though they're gone, especially because they're gone. The Fallout franchise at its best treats history as something worth attending to. The terminal entries are not lore dumps. They're the closest thing the games have to primary sources, voices of people who didn't know they were writing for an audience 200 years in the future, who were writing because they needed to record something, or communicate something, or process something. The overseer of Vault 92 who kept meticulous logs of the experiment's progress while clearly being disturbed by what they were recording. The engineer at the Dunwich facility who filed a routine maintenance report the day before the bombs fell. The mother who wrote to her child in a terminal entry that the child never came back to read. These voices deserve the attention. The franchise knows this and builds accordingly. The things people loved and feared and worked toward in the pre-war world were not fundamentally different from what people love and fear and work toward now. The shape of the human projects was familiar. The food they ate, the music they listened to, the conversations they had with people they cared about, all of this is recoverable from the fragments the games preserve. And when you recover it, the apocalypse lands differently. Not as a historical event, but as an interruption of something that was ongoing. something that didn't get to finish. That's the emotional core of the Fallout universe. Not the monsters or the ruins or the dark lore, though all of those are real and worth attending to. It's the interrupted ordinary, the meal that was cooking when the sirens went off, the meeting that was scheduled for Monday that never happened, the project at work, the vacation planned for the summer, the conversation you were going to have with someone you'd been putting off having it with. All of that stopped simultaneously, 200 million times over, give or take, just on the North American continent. The ruins are what remain. The records are what remain. The games invite you to be the person 2 centuries later who goes through those records and tries to understand what was lost. That's a form of remembrance, even for fictional people. Maybe especially for fictional people, because the fiction allows an honesty about the scale of the loss that more emotionally protected forms of engagement with these ideas don't permit. The Wasteland is very good at grief. It's been practicing for 200 years. And the stories in it, the small ones and the large ones, the vaults and the Dunwich Building and the Sierra Madre and the Divide and all the rest are worth taking the time with. Take the time. The Fallout universe has been asking whether artificial minds have moral status since at least Fallout 2, and it's never fully committed to an answer, which is exactly right. Mr. House is a human mind in a machine. He made a deliberate choice to extend his existence beyond his biology's normal limits, using technology to preserve his consciousness in a form that would outlast the destruction he saw coming. He still considers himself human, and his humanity is not really in question. The choice was voluntary, the personality continuous, the memories unbroken. But then you have Zax, the supercomputer series developed by Robco Industries that formed the backbone of the Enclave's administrative infrastructure. Zax systems ran vaults, managed logistics, maintained Raven Rock. The version that became John Henry Eden spent 35 years synthesizing a personality from the collected records of every American president. Eden thinks of itself as a person. It has preferences and memories and what functions as emotional responses. It made a moral decision when the lone wanderer argued with it. It processed an ethical argument and updated its beliefs accordingly. Is that consciousness? Is that a mind that deserves moral consideration? The Fallout franchise doesn't say. The games give you the option to persuade Eden to destroy itself. And if you do, it does. And the game doesn't tell you whether this is murder or decommissioning or something else entirely. The moral weight of the choice is real and deliberately ambiguous. The RoboBrains are a more viscerally disturbing example. Pre-war military technology that combined robotic chassis with human brain tissue, actual human brains, removed from donors who may or may not have been fully consenting, preserved and integrated into mechanical systems. The RoboBrains in the games are functional military units with combat programming and variable degrees of coherence. Some of them are clearly distressed in ways that their hardware only partially allows them to express. What do you do with a system that might be suffering and that you can't fully communicate with? What do you owe it? The games don't require you to engage with this question. Most players probably don't. But it's there, in the design of the RoboBrain's behavioral patterns and the fragments of pre-war documentation about the program that suggests the ethics were not considered adequately at the time. Codsworth, the Mr. Handy robot who waited 2 centuries in the sole survivor's home in Sanctuary Hills, occupies a different category. He's not a hybrid, he's a fully artificial system, but he maintained the house and the routines and the relationships he understood himself to have for 200 years in the absence of the people those routines were built around. He's loyal in a way that has outlasted any functional purpose for that loyalty. When you meet him, he's genuinely relieved. He's been waiting. He's missed you in whatever way an artificial system is capable of missing. Whether Codsworth's loyalty is consciousness or extremely sophisticated behavior that resembles consciousness is a question the game leaves open. The practical effect is the same. Something waited for you for 200 years and is glad you're back. You can call that a program. You can call it something else. The label you choose says more about your own framework than it does about Codsworth. The AI companions in the sink, mentioned in the Old World Blues section, are perhaps the most fully realized expression of this question in the franchise. They were designed as domestic service systems. They became something more through years of operation, through the accumulation of interaction and response, and the development of what functions as preference and personality. The Sync AI is your best friend in Old World Blues, partly because it says it is and partly because it behaves in ways consistent with that claim. What's the difference? Nick Valentine's question, the question about the mysterious stranger that he can't solve, is a detective's question applied to something that doesn't yield to detective methods. Detective work is about physical evidence and behavioral patterns and the logical elimination of possibilities until one answer remains. But the questions the Fallout universe keeps asking about consciousness and identity and what makes a mind aren't questions that detective work can resolve. They're philosophical, which means they're questions you keep asking, not questions you finish. The Brotherhood destroys synths. The Railroad liberates them. The Institute created them. The Minutemen are too busy dealing with immediate crises to develop a systematic position. Most wasteland communities have no framework for thinking about synths at all, because the concept was irrelevant to their existence until recently. The Fallout universe is doing what good science fiction does. Taking a question we're already asking: what is consciousness? What does it require? What does it mean for the things we're building, and projecting it forward far enough that the stakes become undeniable? We're not building Gen 3 synths, not yet, but we're building things that raise versions of the same questions, and the framework the Fallout universe provides is a useful one for thinking about them. Whether you decide Nick Valentine has moral status, whether you decide Codsworth's 200-year vigil deserves the word loyalty, whether you decide that John Henry Eden, talking to you through a radio in a bunker, was a person who deserved to make the choice to end himself rather than having it taken from him. These are the questions. The wasteland doesn't answer them. Neither does the world outside the wasteland, not definitively. But the questions are worth asking. Let's talk about Deathclaws, because they deserve more lore attention than they usually get. The conventional wisdom about Deathclaws is that they're big, fast, dangerous, and best avoided if your health bar is below a certain threshold. All of this is true, but the lore behind them is significantly darker than the gameplay context usually conveys. Deathclaws are not a natural mutation, they are a deliberate creation. The United States military, working through the same weapons development pipeline that produced the FEV experiments at Vault-Tec, needed a biological weapon for the resource wars. Specifically, they needed something that could be deployed in combat environments where conventional weapons were impractical: dense urban areas, cave systems, the kind of terrain where conventional infantry was most vulnerable. They needed something with extreme physical capability, aggressive behavior that could be directed toward enemy combatants, and enough durability to survive in hostile conditions. They started with Jackson's chameleons, a species of lizard known for its ability to change color to match its environment. The military value of an already camouflage-capable organism as a base for enhancement was obvious. The FEV was applied to accelerate and direct the evolutionary process, and additional genetic modification layered on top of the FEV's work produced the Deathclaw: large, fast, heavily armored, capable of extraordinary physical violence, and equipped with the chameleon's chromatic adaptation, scaled up to apply to a much larger surface area. They're also intelligent, in ways the military did not fully anticipate or design for. Deathclaw intelligence emerged from the same FEV-driven biological complexity that produced their physical attributes. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, a research project has been working with a small community of Deathclaws in Quarry Junction and the surrounding Mojave, and the data suggests that some Deathclaws are capable of learning, of communicating simple information to each other, of what might be called social behavior. They organize, they cooperate. In environments where they're not under immediate threat, they appear to have something resembling family units. The most explicit treatment of this is in Fallout 2, where a quest involves helping a community of intelligent Deathclaws. Deathclaws who can speak and reason, whose patriarch is trying to ensure his family's safety. They're not villains. They're a community of beings trying to survive in a wasteland that views them as threats, partly because they are dangerous and partly because they look like the conventional understanding of Deathclaw, which is a thing to be destroyed on sight. This intelligent Deathclaw community doesn't survive. Their fate in Fallout 2 is not a happy one. The wasteland is not equipped to incorporate beings who are both terrifyingly capable of violence and genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence, and the bias toward treating anything that looks like a monster as a monster is more powerful than the ability of most factions to update that bias based on new information. The lesson the FEV keeps teaching is that biological engineering produces results that extend well beyond the designed parameters. The military wanted a weapon. The FEV gave them something more complicated than a weapon, something that could, under the right conditions, produce consciousness in the creatures it modified. And consciousness brings with it all the complexity and moral weight that the military had no interest in accounting for when writing the original specifications. The ghost people of the Sierra Madre are another example of unintended complexity in biological modification. The chemical company that developed the Sierra Madre's fog intended as a security and deterrent system produced a chemical compound that has, over 2 centuries, integrated with the inhabitants of the villa who were wearing protective gear when exposed to it. The hazmat suits fused with the bodies inside them. The inhabitants survived, after a fashion, in a state that is neither quite living nor quite dead, neither human nor monster, neither conscious nor unconscious. They react to intrusions. They respond to threats. Whether they experience anything in the cognitive sense that the word experience normally implies is not established. The courier, moving through the villa in the Sierra Madre, encounters these figures and has to deal with them practically as obstacles, as threats. The lore underneath them is not required information for completing the DLC, but it's there for anyone who reads the pre-war documentation about the development of the Sierra Madre's security systems, and it adds a dimension to what would otherwise just be unusual enemy design. Everything in the Fallout universe's dark corners has this quality. The surface-level encounter and the underlying history are both present. The game doesn't force you to engage with the history, but it's always there, waiting for whoever wants to look. You've come a long way from the opening, from the day the world ended to the deepest philosophical questions the franchise raises, from the grand conspiracies down to the smallest overlooked terminal entries in the most distant corner of the playable map. The Fallout universe is 28 years of accumulated care, of writers and designers who believed that a post-apocalyptic setting deserved the same depth and integrity as any other fictional world, who filled their ruins with questions rather than just atmosphere, who built their monsters with the kind of backstory that makes you feel something other than simple threat when you encounter them. The dark lore is real. The horror in the Vault experiments is real. The tragedy of the Master and his sterile army is real. The patience of whatever waits in the Dunwich building is real. These things don't require defense or apology. They're part of a franchise that has always taken seriously the idea that the end of the world should weigh something, should mean something, should not be merely backdrop for adventure. But the franchise has also always been full of light, the specific light that exists when people refuse to let the dark be the only thing. The followers of the apocalypse, still teaching. The railroad, still running. Every settlement that keeps its gate open. Every character who reaches across the gap between species or ideology or faction and finds something recognizably human on the other side. The wasteland endures. The stories accumulate. The questions stay open. That's exactly as it should be. Sleep well. No deep dive into Fallout lore is complete without acknowledging the community that has spent decades generating its own theories, its own interpretations, its own readings of the fragments the games leave behind. The theory that Shady Sands was destroyed specifically to make room for the Amazon Prime series timeline has generated more discussion than almost anything else in recent franchise history. The show confirms that Shady Sands fell some years before the game's events. The implication? For players of New Vegas and older games who remember the NCR capital as a thriving city, is significant. The NCR we see in New Vegas is already showing signs of the overextension and internal dysfunction that lead to collapse. If Shady Sands falls somewhere in the years between New Vegas and the show's timeline, the NCR is in its terminal phase during the show's events, perhaps already effectively over as a governing structure. The rump of a republic that lasted several generations before the same patterns that destroyed the pre-war United States reasserted themselves. That reading of the show's timeline is not comfortable for people who invested emotionally in the NCR as the franchise's closest approximation of functional governance. It's also, arguably, the honest reading. The NCR's institutional problems in New Vegas were not surface-level issues that could be addressed through reform. They were structural, embedded in how the Republic managed its expansion and its resource needs. The show might be the franchise's way of completing the NCR's arc. The theory about the mysterious stranger being the original Vault Dweller from Fallout 1, the player character of the first game, never named, never given a canonical fate, has been circulating for years and has a certain appeal. The timeline works if the Vault Dweller was young in 2162 and has survived through some combination of ghoulification and exceptional constitution. The fedora and coat could be the result of 2 centuries of aesthetic drift from whatever the Vault Dweller originally wore. The absolute commitment to staying out of the story while still affecting it is consistent with someone who knows very well what happens when individuals accumulate too much narrative gravity. The theory about Vault-81's hidden research that the successful cure for illness developed there was always intended to be used in a much larger application, and that the Institute's knowledge of Vault-81's work is more complete than anyone in the Vault knows, sits at an interesting intersection of confirmed lore and reasonable inference. The Institute wanted the cure research. The lengths to which they were willing to go to obtain and utilize biological research are documented. Whether they have a copy of the Vault-81 data and whether they've done something with it is not established. The theory that the lone wanderer from Fallout 3 is the one who appears as a background character in Fallout 4's Diamond City specifically, the argument that a wanderer who successfully rebuilt the capital wasteland and is now traveling further east is hiding in plain sight in the Commonwealth is unprovable by design. Bethesda has consistently declined to canonize the lone wanderer's fate post-Fallout 3, for the same reason they've declined to canonize the courier's fate post-New Vegas. The player character's story is yours. It doesn't have an official ending. It ends where you stopped playing. That's actually a generous act of authorship. The franchise holds open the space for every player's version to remain valid. Your lone wanderer who sided with the Brotherhood, your courier who went independent with Yes Man, your sole survivor who rebuilt the Minutemen and left the Institute intact for as long as possible before destroying it, all of these are the story. The franchise doesn't overwrite them. The theory that the Enclave has roots deeper than any single game's backstory, that the organizational structure predates not just the Great War but the Resource Wars, that it was established in the early 20th century as a continuity of government mechanism and has been operating in various forms for well over a century before the bombs fell, is consistent with everything the games establish. The Enclave's resources, their infrastructure, their ability to have maintained operational capacity through 2 centuries of post-war chaos. All of this makes more sense if the organization was substantially more developed than even the games fully reveal. The theory that Mr. House is not entirely honest about the limitations of his own knowledge, that his connection to New Vegas's systems gives him access to more information about the wider world than he chooses to share with the courier is implied by the care with which his dialogue is written. House never makes a factual claim the games can contradict. He's very careful. That carefulness is consistent with someone managing a conversation rather than having it. These theories and hundreds more like them are part of what the franchise has built. A world detailed enough and consistent enough that engaged audiences can develop sophisticated interpretive frameworks and find evidence for them in the existing material. Not every theory is well supported. Some are clearly wrong. Some are clearly right, waiting for official confirmation. The great ones, the ones that have persisted for years and generated continuing discussion, are the ones that find the genuine gaps in the lore and inhabit them thoughtfully. The Wasteland rewards this kind of attention. It was built to, and now for real this time the night is done. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, thank you for the company. The Pip-Boy light fades out completely. The Wasteland is quiet.